Good morning. Can I welcome members, guests and the public watching on the webcast to today's meeting of the Environment Committee. This meeting will be taking place on an informal virtual basis with Assembly members and guests participating remotely. We won't be taking formal decisions or agree the minutes of the committee's meeting on 27th of January, which were included in the published agenda. Instead, the minutes will be deferred to the next formal meeting of the committee, but I'm happy to take any inquiries or comments on that item. For transparency, we will still declare any interests and we are also able to note items. I'll call Assembly members to speak by name during the Q&A. Can I ask everyone to check that their electronic devices are switched to silent mode and their microphones are switched to mute when they're not talking to avoid any interruptions? Can I ask the clerk to confirm any apologies for absence?
Thank you, Chair. No apologies for absence have been received.
Thank you, Paul. Declarations of interest. Can we note the list of offices held by Assembly members?
Noted.
Thank you. And can I also ask members if they have any disclosable pecuniary interests in specific items listed on the agenda?
No.
I'm seeing that as a no.
No.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. Minutes. As mentioned, we were unable to agree today the minutes of the meeting held on 27th of January, but will shortly. Does anyone have any comments?
No.
Thank you very much, Assembly Member Devonish. Summary list of actions. Can we note the ongoing actions arising from previous meetings of the Environment Committee?
Noted.
Thank you very much.
Noted.
That brings us to today's main item, which is our investigation into air pollution in London. And this is our second meeting focusing on this vital topic. And I would like to welcome today's guests and thank them for joining us virtually. Joining us again is Elliot Trahan, who's Head of Air Quality at Greater London Authority. Welcome to Oliver Lord, Head of Clean Cities Campaign UK. Sarah Berry, Trustee of Living Streets and Active Travel Advocate. Christina Calderato, Director of Transport Strategy and Policy for Transport for London. Dr. Ian Mudway, MRC Centre for Environment and Health, Imperial College London. And finally, Simon Birkett, Founder and Director of Clean Air in London. Again, welcome and thank you very much for joining us. We have a lot of business to get through today, and we've noted that remote, sometimes it can slow down. So I just ask all Assembly members and guests just to keep answers as succinct as possible so we can keep things moving. And I can see an indication from Assembly Member McCartney.
Yes, thank you, Chair. Just before we start, can I just declare that in my new role as Deputy Mayor for Children and Families, I will be taking on some of the work with regards to super zones. And we did ask some questions in our last meeting that forms part of this investigation. So I thought I should just formally declare that.
Thank you very much for your transparency. So beginning with the questions and answers, if I can begin with Christina. Christina, how does transport pollution in London compare to other cities in style and scale of type?
Hi, good morning. Thank you for having me. So air quality in London, obviously, it's improved hugely since 2016. So in 2016, we had 2 million Londoners, including 400,000 children living in areas that exceeded legal levels of air pollution. And in 2019, that had reduced to 119,000 people, so a reduction of 94%. The reduction in the number of primary and secondary schools exceeding legal limits also fell by 97%. So we've come a really, really long way in London. But despite our progress, we know that we do still have roads in London, 24% of roads in inner London still exceeding the legal limits for NO2, and that much or essentially all of London still exceeds the World Health Organization recommended limits for PM2.5, and that's the pollutant which has the greatest impact on human health. We know that other kind of sectors have been reducing their emissions, but the emissions coming from transport in terms of air quality emissions as well as carbon are still high, and that we need to do more to tackle that. Cities around the world are obviously taking different approaches to this, but the work that we've done in London, the world-leading Ultra Low Emission Zone that was introduced in central London in 2019, has kind of been a real world leader in taking that kind of dramatic step, which we've seen has been so successful in reducing those air pollutants. So since we have expanded the ULEZ, we've seen that the compliance in the first month has been at 92%. That's a really high level of compliance. So we can see that the steps that we are taking in London are having a really kind of significant impact. Different cities are taking different approaches, but nowhere is taking such a kind of, has introduced a zone like the Ultra Low Emission Zone, which has had such significant impact so quickly.
Thank you, Christina. If I can move to Ollie then. Ollie, I want to ask you specifically about the powers of both the Mayor, London Boroughs and TfL. How does the powers that these bodies have compare to powers around the world, particularly in tackling air pollution?
Yeah, well, and also just in response to that last question, like London's definitely not alone with like the stubbornness of nitrogen dioxide across Europe. A lot of the cities, major cities, are facing the same challenge, and a lot of it is related to diesel, which is where the powers come in to some extent. I mean, there are obviously two pollutants of concern for the city as particulate matter as well. But when we talk about transport, as we are doing on today's committee, nitrogen dioxide is a huge issue. With regards to the powers, I mean, we all know that the Mayor has very strong powers in relation to transport and transport emissions. And that was also referred to in the Mayor's report, and the Net Zero report, that actually his strongest powers are there. So therefore, there's potential to take a lot more action. And how that relates to other cities, well, we all love a comparison to Paris, for example, but we do know that the Mayor of Paris actually has control over all the roads within the centre of the city. So there's quite a substantial difference that the Mayor can take, action, for example, to remove parking spaces and actually have that as a coordinated piece of action, which we'd love to see over time in somewhere like the centre of London. But that requires a lot of discussion with the local authorities, as you would expect. In New York, for example, you've got another difference whereby actually, believe it or not, the Mayor of New York doesn't control the tube system, so it's actually run by the state. So then you find it very difficult to integrate your transport services as well as you do find in London, which actually the integration that Transport for London provides is definitely a world leader in that respect. So it's definitely a challenge for every city. There isn't really a city that has all the powers it needs, but we do know the powers that the Mayor has, and I'm sure we'll explore today how that Mayor could be using those powers further.
Thank you, Ollie. That was a really nice introduction. So moving now, if I can turn to Simon. Simon, what impact is air pollution from transport having on Londoners? And what more could we do to make sure that we achieve full compliance with the new World Health Organization guidelines, or the altered World Health Organization guidelines, I should say?
Thank you, Zach. Can you hear me all right?
Yes, loud and clear.
Thank you. It's important to think of the air as one thing. Splitting it into air quality and greenhouse gases has given us problems like diesel and wood burning because people have thought that these might deal with one part of the air, but we need to think of the air as one entity, so one air, as it were. And in terms of air pollution, there are two types. There are particles and gases. The particles are regulated as a lump for health and legal purposes, so all particles in a cloud up to a certain diameter. And you will have heard of PM2.5 and PM10. For the gases, the whole cloud of gases, there are gases like sulfur dioxide, carbon monoxide, and so on, but nitrogen dioxide, which Ollie has mentioned, is the one which gets most attention because there's a lot of it caused by diesel and by gas burning. It's pretty easy to measure. And levels in London have been very high, and at one stage the scientists were pretty sure that London had the highest monitored levels of nitrogen dioxide in the world. Through action by successive mayors, that level has come down. But to put it in perspective, how far we still have to go and how serious the air pollution problem is in London, let me just focus first on nitrogen dioxide. The average level of nitrogen dioxide, this toxic gas, so far this year in Brixton Road is 70 micrograms per cubic metre, not 70. In Putney High Street, it's 64, Hanger Lane Giatry, 61, Marylebone Road, 51, Walbrook Wharf in the city, 51. Now, the World Health Organization air quality guideline and legal limit used to be 40, but that was set in 2005, 2006. Last September, the World Health Organization published new air quality guidelines, which halved the guideline level for particles from 10 as an average across the whole year to 5, and they found no safe level. And for nitrogen dioxide, they slashed the guideline from 40 to 10. So Brixton Road, if these levels of nitrogen dioxide continued for the whole year, they would be 7 times the new World Health Organization air quality guideline. And similarly, 5 and 6 for those other sites I mentioned. So despite achievements by successive mayors on reducing pollution, and I'm very pleased that Sadiq has made it one of his absolute top priorities, but we should be in no doubt that there is a very, very serious problem with air pollution in London. For particles, it's between 10 and 15 micrograms per cubic metre compared to the WHO guideline of 5. And this is the largest, it's well recognised as being the largest environmental health risk. So to tackle this, we need to tackle the sources of these different pollutants, and the sources are slightly different. Particles can come from any source, from tyre and brake wear, from construction, but actually a large part of it is comes from it's secondary particles as opposed to primary particles which come out of exhausts or chimneys. And so a very high proportion actually comes from agriculture, from ammonia, from manure, but also from fertilizers on fields, which reacts in the air to become secondary particles, which becomes obviously part of what we breathe in London, a large part. But for nitrogen dioxide, the key things we need to do is finish the job of banning diesel. That is an absolute priority, but we also clearly need to get rid of petrol as a fuel as well. And we need to start tackling the emissions from buildings. The planning system is hopelessly slow and weak, and we need to tackle those emissions from buildings. So different things that need to be done, but I couldn't emphasize strongly enough the urgency of big action here. London, despite having a record of doing some big, bold things, including the very successful expansion of the Ultra Low Emission Zone, is risking falling behind other world cities like Paris and New York. So we really need some big new ideas, and I hope we'll discuss some of those this morning. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Simon. I'm sure we will be doing. I've had an indication at this point from Assemblymember Devonish, who's got a short supplementary, I believe.
Thank you, Chair. I just wanted to pay tribute to Simon and the way he's put his opening remarks today. I've been working with Simon for 15 years, and it's the thorough way that he goes into the empirical analysis and really digs deep and keeps pushing all of us in public office to really do more. So thank you, Simon, for all that you're doing. We haven't really got another 15 years. We need to really accelerate the pace now, but thank you for all that you're doing. And any concrete ideas you've got during this today would be really good for all of us. Thank you for your time.
Thanks, Tony.
Thanks, Assemblymember Devonish. That really was brief. So now if I can turn to Sarah Berry. Sarah, could I ask you about what do you think the Mayor could be doing to support more eco-friendly transport options, and how could he be advocating more towards active travel and supporting Londoners in that?
Yeah, for sure. Thank you, and thanks for having me today. I think this has been spoken about already by all of the speakers. I think the Mayor's doing a really fantastic job with a lot of the measures that are being brought in to support active travel. You know, we've spoken about the expansion of the Ultra Low Emission Zone. We've spoken about a few other things today, but there's a few things that haven't come up yet. I always like to think of these things in terms of carrots and sticks, and we've seen quite a few sticks come through over recent years, especially since COVID. So thinking about things like the expansion of the Ultra Low Emission Zone, making it more expensive to drive more heavily polluting vehicles, and thinking about other measures that sort of make it a little bit more difficult to get around by car and a lot easier to get around in terms of active travel. And those sort of carrots in that sense are some of the things that we've seen in terms of low traffic neighbourhoods being introduced, things that make it, a little bit harder to drive in certain areas and a lot easier and a lot more pleasant to walk and cycle, or to get public transportation, things like school streets that make it easier to do the school drop off, which is, one of the, biggest causes of congestion in my area. And I'm sure it's the case for a lot of others. When you go out during the school run, the number of cars on the road is just mind boggling. So school streets that make it easier and safer for parents to take their kids to school via active travel means, and other things that make public transport easier that you can combine with other forms of active transport, like bus lanes and things like that mean that you're not going to be stuck in traffic that are there by cars. I do think that one of the things that could be really interesting to explore for the Mayor here is around thinking a little bit more on those incentives. And one of the things that I've been really excited by in recent times is a scheme in Coventry, which is giving people the opportunity to trade in their cars and get mobility credits or even a free bike. And for a lot of people, the bikes that they would need in order to replace a lot of their car journeys are probably definitely more expensive than the average family can afford. You're looking at e-bikes, especially for hilly parts of London and for people who are older and less mobile. And you're looking at cargo bikes, especially for parents who have kids that they want to transport around and people who have to move a lot of things. So I think a lot of conversations that I have with local people around here about giving up their car and moving towards active travel, they say to me, well, when this car gives out, I'm definitely going to give it up and I'm going to switch. But that incentive to do that earlier than when that car gives out isn't necessarily there. So if we could find a way to sort of give people the opportunity to get rid of their cars sooner, whether or not that's mobility credits, whether or not that's a subscription to a car share service or access to bikes and things like that. I think that's a huge thing. And the other one, it's boring, but it's so important, which is bike storage, especially for non-standard bikes. There are a lot of people that I speak to who are like, yeah, I would love to give up my car and go around by cargo bike, but where would I keep the thing? And that's a really difficult question for a lot of folks to answer, especially when you're worried about that being stolen and you're worried about the financial implications. It's often a lot easier and a lot safer to just keep a car, it feels, than it is to get a bike. And that seems absurd and like something that would be really great to tackle.
Thanks, Sarah. I'm not sure anything is ever boring on the Environment Committee. We love the policy detail, and actually bike storage is really important. I've got an indication from Ollie. Ollie, please do come in.
Just on the bike storage, perhaps remind the Assembly that the Mayor had a commitment, also the eco commitment in his manifesto to deliver 5,000 secure bike hangars in this term. We're talking about a 1,000-day term, 5 a day. We'd love to see those going in, but I'm uncertain whether that's actually happening at the moment.
Thank you very much for that. I'm going to turn to Dr. Mudway now. Ian, what have been your findings so far in understanding the health impacts of air pollution, and what measures should the Mayor be taking to focus on addressing the issue? Oh, sorry, you're on mute. I definitely had lockdown memories then.
I won't reflect upon my own findings, but I reflect upon the findings of the entirety of the health community. I guess in terms of the conversations we've had so far, the important thing to bear in mind is there's a reason why the World Health Organization have reduced their guideline values for PM 2.5. And indeed, I think the term is correct by Simon, slashed the annual standard for nitrogen dioxide. And that's because the weight of evidence illustrating impacts on health below the previous guideline values is incredibly strong. So I used to say it in these meetings 10 years ago that we had our limit values from the EU, and that there was this sort of desire to just be beneath them, but that was missing the point because there was no safe level. The WHO revisions reflect that. But in addition to the fact that there's evidence suggesting a significant mortality burden associated to both exposure to PM 2.5, those fine particles in the air, and NO2, I think 2 or 3 things have emerged over the last decade which really focus our attention. The first of that really has been the impact of air pollution and the air pollution within our city, measurably within our city, on children's health and children's development over time. And there are two reasons why this is important. A, because people care about the health of their children and their grandchildren, often more than they do about their own health during their middle age. I mean, this is a true fact. But also because what we now know is that you are storing up illness within the population. You're making your population more vulnerable to the diseases they will get in later life. So that the exposures today will have impacts on the health of London's population in 10, 20, 30 years' time down the line. And that really matters in terms of the health of the city and its long-term costs. The other area which I think has become incredibly important over the last decade is an appreciation that air pollution doesn't just impact on the heart and on the lungs, but it has impacts on the brain. And those impacts on the brain are not yet costed into all of those health evaluations and economic evaluations produced by the World Health Organization or the OECD for Europe. The links between air pollution and dementia risk are profound and important in terms of their monetary costs to the both social care and sort of like central healthcare services on top of their social care. And also there's illustrations that air pollution in our city impacts the mental health of our population, and there are associated costs there as well. So I would argue 10 years ago, if I was in this meeting, I'd be saying there's plenty of evidence that we have to tackle air pollution to have a really healthy population, yes, going forward, and to avoid unnecessary health costs falling upon our population. What I'd say now is that evidence is even more alarming, and the sort of motivation for action is stronger now than it's ever been.
Thank you very much. That's really clear there, especially with the science. Can I pass over to Assemblymember Bokhari, who's got a supplementary for you?
Thank you, Ian. Thank you so much for what you just said. It really does hit the points of why this discussion is so important. And I want to specifically talk about what you just mentioned about children's health, and particularly their lung capacity. I know that we've talked about this in the previous committee, but I want to know what you think the Mayor should be doing directly about this particular issue about children's health, particularly if you think about the fact that we're getting data from places like Tower Hamlets where children's lungs are actually smaller than other places in this country. And this is shocking to kind of get that kind of evidence now that are coming in. What specifically do you think the Mayor could be doing in this particular area? And what do you think parents can do right now? There are a lot of parents and mums and dads that I'm talking to that I do the school run with who are really, really consciously worried. What can we do right now?
So many of the actions which are in place in terms of tackling nitrogen dioxide emissions in school streets will help to a certain extent, yes, but they won't eliminate the nature of this problem. And this lung stunting problem hasn't just been seen in London, it's been seen elsewhere. And I suppose the actual volume changes, because I was involved in that study, are relatively small in the short term. But what it's about is just an indication that the development of the lung is going off target, yes? And that tells you something about disease risk downstream. What can you do now? Well, in terms of a parent, and I'm a parent in London, my children attend schools in London. I've had to walk them to school along busy roads. You are more or less restricted to thinking about how you use the city and taking lower pollution routes to school, if those routes actually exist. One of the things I would strongly advocate against is driving your children to school. Most of the work I've ever done looking at in-vehicle exposures to pollutants illustrates that unless you have a fantastically new vehicle with a new filter, the exposures in that vehicle are higher than if you were walking along the side of the road. And I think that's an important message to get across to parents as well. If there was a few things I would like to do to try to get some movement in this area of schools, I would love air pollution mitigation to be part of a school safeguarding commitment in Ofsted. I think we'd find many more schools would jump on that and be willing to do something if they felt it was part of their Ofsted inspection regime, that was a safeguarding issue. The other thing I'd highlight is that knowing that there's an association between poor air quality and children's respiratory health and development across time, what we should absolutely not be doing, and I hope I can come back to this later, is building new schools or building cheap and affordable housing for young families in areas which are known pollution hotspots within our city. And I know there are sort of conflicting and intersecting issues here, but I think that I can think of many examples within London where I see new builds occurring in places which, if you were really concerned about children's health, you would never be building them there, and you certainly wouldn't be targeting them to young families.
Thank you. I can see a hand from Simon.
Thank you. That was a very good answer from Ian. I think all I would add to that is that it's important, first of all, to warn parents so that they know about this, because not all of them do, which was highlighted by the tragic case of Ella Roberta Adukisi Deborah, where no one mentioned the pollution problem to Rosamond. So it is important to warn people and give them advice about protecting themselves and reducing pollution for themselves and others. So in a sense, that's adaptation and mitigation, like climate things. We need to think about indoor air and outdoor air. And of course, then there are the area-wide measures, such as some of the school street things. But we can talk separately about those later. Thank you.
Thank you, Simon. I'm going to hand over now to Assemblymember McCartney.
Thank you, Chair. Can I just stay with Dr. Mudway, if I can, for the moment? I think we've talked about what current things we could do, but can I just ask you, and we heard earlier that cities such as Paris have more control over their roads and their parking. What extra powers do you think the mayor should have to enable him to make some other bold decisions that would enable him to have a really big impact on air quality?
Am I really the person to ask this question? I think Simon would be a better person to do this. I think we have to accelerate towards the extinction of the internal combustion engine within London. I think that's the direction of travel for a variety of reasons, and we have to make it more possible and safer for people to walk their children to and from school and to take lower pollution options. I completely agree. We still need to do a lot of education. I sometimes think we've done it for a very long time and everybody must know by now. But I have to say, listening to discussions about the ULEZ and some of the conversations from people in the sort of like more outer zones, it's quite clear that the message about these actions being about protecting the health of the population as being, you know, some sort of other sort of strategy has not reached all people. So I think that we really have to move away from our current love affair with the motor vehicle. And I suppose in a sense, and I hope this would be picked up, this isn't simply about replacing every vehicle on London's road with an electric vehicle. This is about actually reducing our dependence on the motor vehicle and the number of unnecessary journeys that are made. And that may not answer your question, but people who are better policy focused to do that.
That is helpful. Perhaps I can come to Simon then, who's got his hand up.
Yeah, thank you. Just a few quick things. I'm sure we'll cover them more generally in the agenda, but you know, the mayor's got control over a very small proportion of the roads. It's just the red routes, and quite a lot of measures get sort of bogged down in arguments between councils and the mayor and things, you know, often for good reason. But you know, Park Lane would be an example of a road which he controls, but you know, there are roads on and off it, and so on. So I think the arrangements for control of the roads, and I don't know what the right balance is, but there is a balance. Coming up with some solution with vehicle excise duty. You know, I think it's, you know, this is something which for people who drive most of the time in London, the VED is basically used most of the time in London. So I think, you know, it's something bold here from the government, but also from the mayor to respond positively to the government would be good. Non-road mobile machinery, which we're going to talk about, powers over buildings. But I don't think we should forget the elephant in the room, in a sense, which is, you know, powers are one thing, but without money, they're nothing. And the big elephant in the room here is TfL refinancing, and whether you blame COVID for that, or the mayor for that, or the government for this problem, it is really, I don't know what the sort of phrase is, but I mean, London is sort of just getting stuck in this no man's land. It's not good for the country. It's not good for London. And we need to address money as well as powers. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I can see, Ollie, you have your hand up.
Yeah, if you don't mind, I'll just contribute to that a little bit. I agree with Simon on vehicle excise duty. I think it's unfair that Transport for London has to maintain busy arterial roads in the city, and there's a lot of people that don't drive that actually have to contribute to that. The mayor does have powers to direct the boroughs, which may well not be that popular, but there are options to actually maybe tally a few of the laggards along. I would also think about powers. Perhaps at some point we'll discuss the increase of diesel vans on our streets today, and whether there's any powers to start to maybe apply a small charge to next day deliveries and things like that, which I know during the pandemic wouldn't be appropriate, but as we come out of that, we are seeing a resurgence in that. And the other could be around workplace parking levies as well, which maybe we'll discuss at some point, but that would be quite helpful, especially in the outer London region with the amount of car commuting.
Thank you. Can I move now to Elliot, if I can? And I suppose I want to ask you the same question, what powers would the mayor want? But also, could you tell me what green transport projects and programmes have been the most effective in London in addressing poor air quality?
So yes, good morning everyone, and thank you for having me again. Perhaps just to start off with your second question first, Joanne, in terms of what have been some of the most effective policies. We've been really lucky in London that we've been able to experiment and really push the envelope in terms of the policies and interventions that we've implemented, which, as Christina explained, have had this transformational effect on air quality, but also, as Simon set out very well, while that's great progress, there is still a very long way to go, and we are not complacent about that in any way, shape or form. Obviously, the jewel in the crown is the ULEZ, and particularly when you look in central London, where we've got the longest period of data, the change that we've seen, the 44% reduction at roadside NO2 concentrations is absolutely brilliant. But I think there is actually one other star of the show that we haven't really spoken about much so far, which is worth talking about a bit more, and that is the work that we've done with buses. And they're a relatively small fleet, around 9,000 vehicles, and the work we've done focusing on improving them have been absolutely fantastic. So you've had around a 90% reduction from some of the older polluting buses when we've retrofitted those. We've seen around a 70% reduction in overall bus emissions since 2016. And clearly, there's a huge opportunity, and hopefully we'll get to talk about this a bit more with net zero as well, in terms of the electrification of the fleet. So, there's been some really good practice in London. We obviously also recognise that we've got lots to learn. We've been talking a lot about walking and cycling. We've also been talking about vehicle electrification for those remaining vehicles after you kind of get that mode shift to walking and cycling that you want to switch to zero emission, where we've still got lots to learn from other places. But I think that London's got a good track record. I think just one other point I'd make before I come on to the question of powers is around, there's also a huge economic opportunity here. So one of the pieces of work that we've done in terms of switching the taxi fleet to zero emission capable, we've now got over 5,000 zero emission capable taxis in the fleet and on the streets, has actually been creating economic opportunity in the UK, a new factory in Coventry, significant investment, international investment, and creating jobs. And I think we need to kind of articulate this story and create these win-wins. We're actually creating new economic opportunity by actually addressing emissions in London. And on your question of powers, I think it's been set out very well by colleagues. If we do get an opportunity later, I can go into a bit more detail about non-road mobile machinery. I think they're akin to buses in some ways, a relatively small number of pieces of equipment causing a huge proportion of emissions, and we just don't have the powers that we need to properly address those. So I can go into that a bit more detail later if that's helpful.
That would be helpful. Thank you. And you'll be pleased to know, I think we've got a section on buses as well. So, Chair, back to you.
Thank you very much. Assembly Member Best.
Thank you, Chair. I just wanted to quickly come back to Elliot and talk about you talked about the ULEZ being the jewel in the crown. I couldn't help but it reminds me of this recent bit of research we've seen about the junk food ad contributing to 1,000 calories lost in the household, per week. And it's a bit like that with the ULEZ. We know for a fact that these cars were coming off the road. We know for a fact these cars were coming off the road, and that by 2030, the change, whether we had the ULEZ or not, was going to be negligible. So, to say it's all the impact of the ULEZ, when we know that these cars were coming naturally off the road, we have to see there has to be some evaluation of what choices were being made anyway, and where things have perhaps been sped up. So it's a bit more nuanced than that, and I think it does bear fruit to actually weave that into the conversation. I wanted to come back to Ian though as well, and I think we have to be very clear. I live in Chingford, so I'm in the outer London. And you said there's a misrepresentation here of what the ULEZ is. That's completely untrue. People understand what the challenges of air quality are, but we don't have another option. If you look at where I live, for example, you've got, I live somewhere where it would be 15 minutes for me to drive to most places, but an hour to take public transport in the same direction. So people are looking around and asking, what is my other option? And until we tackle those last 2 miles in outer London, people just don't have another option. And so it's not fair to ask people to make these changes or say they don't understand the problem when they just don't have another option. And that's simply it, and so I really appreciate when Sarah was talking about the incentives, because that's what it is, and I completely agree with the travel credits and incentivizing that switch to cars, because obviously for a lot of people that I see, and for myself even, the bike that I would need to replace my car costs about double what my car costs, to be honest. So that's the problem, and so I just want to know how the panel would like to address that, where we simply don't have another option. We know, as I think Simon mentioned earlier, TfLs for challenges. So we know we can't just, extend every bus lane, extend every train line. So how do we help people now in outer London?
So maybe if I just come back on your first point, Emma, which I think is a very fair point. Obviously, you do get natural change in the vehicle fleet. So it's important that we also, and we do this analysis, so that you can actually understand what the ULEZ itself has actually achieved in terms of accelerating that natural rate of change. And in the reports, and we're happy to share this with you, we've done some really good analysis, which has looked at scenarios with the ULEZ and without the ULEZ to fully understand what the impact has been. And I think the attributable reduction to the ULEZ itself is in central London, for the central London ULEZ, was something around 37%. And we've also done some work comparing the pace of change that we saw in central London, where we introduced the central London ULEZ versus the rest of London. And again, you really see this real dramatic change as a result of the policy intervention. So it does demonstrate what an impact these schemes can have. But I also think you make a very fair point around it's important that we provide targeted help to people, and that we also put in place the right incentives to help people make greener decisions. Obviously, we talked about scrappage in the past. I think hopefully we'll have an opportunity to talk about that a bit more today. And I was really interested in what Sarah was saying again around how you can kind of build in those incentives to encourage people to, either give up their car, move to a car club, use public transport, or even better, get them walking and cycling. So, you're absolutely right. We need to think about this holistically, and it's not just about one intervention, it's about the package.
Maybe I'll jump in off the back of that as well. I hear you on the challenges of outer London. The further away that you get from the centre of city, the harder that this stuff gets. My sister-in-law lives in Kingston, and we've cycled out there a few times from Brixton, and you really see the sort of difference in infrastructure and all the other sort of changes that happen there. I think the one thing that I try to keep in mind with this stuff is that it can be very easy to fall into an all or nothing approach, when realistically, every journey that people are able to take that is more sustainable, that is cleaner, is good for the city. And thinking about how you manage, how you encourage people to take not necessarily every journey and give up their car when they're in outer London. I totally hear what you're saying about the fact that if it takes someone a 15-minute drive and an hour by public transport, then that option is going to be pretty clear what they're going to take. But how do we make that 15-minute drive derive a much more pleasant cycling experience, for instance, on an e-bike, and how long does that journey look like? And it might be that we can't replace every single journey that people are doing in these outer London suburbs with walking or cycling or public transport. We might not have the funds for those things, but encouraging those much smaller sort of 2-mile journeys that you're talking about, the last 2 miles, getting people on their bikes to do those and to make those safer and sustainable is really important. And it's such a wicked problem, which I'm sure everyone here knows, is the fact that the less safe it feels to cycle, the more people get in their cars, and the more people who get in their cars, the less safe it feels to cycle. And so it just sort of becomes a little bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy there. But when you think about things that have happened, out towards Kingston, and you look at the new cycle infrastructure that's gone in there, and thinking about mobility hubs as a solution there as well. There's amazing ways that people can, cycle to the train station, store their bikes there. They have really good, on the topic of what I was talking about before, they have non-standard bike storage options at Kingston Station now. So if you've got a hand cycle, or if you've got a cargo bike, or if you've got any of these things, you can store those there safely and know that you're not going to be in a bit of trouble, and those sorts of things that enable people to combine journeys in a way that rules out a car. So I think those things, in terms of, it doesn't have to be all or nothing, thinking about individual and sort of some journeys that are taken in a sustainable way, but then also thinking about how we can combine different journeys of sustainable methods. So a bike to the bus stop or a bike to the train station, to sort of mean that we're giving up the car for those longer journeys as well.
Thank you very much. Christina, I can see you've indicated, if I could beg your patience, just because very shortly there's going to be a whole section specifically on ULEZ with questions aimed at you. So I'm going to keep the meeting moving because we're still in our introductory section. On which note, I'll hand over to Assembly Member Bakari to move things along. Thank you.
Thank you. This is going to be about the Mayor's strategies and initiatives, and I'm going to start with Elliot. How do the Mayor's strategies on environment and transport suggest the next steps on air pollution should be taken, and what impact will the pathways to net zero have on the Mayor's TfL current plans to reduce air pollution from London's transports?
Okay, that's a good question. Maybe to start off with, I think we're very lucky both. Perhaps it's just worth taking a very quick step back in terms of the way we actually developed our strategies. So in 2016, when we started work on the strategies, we worked really closely with our colleagues at Transport for London and really made sure that the London Environment Strategy, the Mayor's Transport Strategy, the London Plan, and also the Health and Equality Strategy were all really well integrated documents. And one of the key unifying principles underneath them was the concept of healthy streets. And I think that really, and I think this perhaps builds a little bit on what I think Ian was saying earlier in terms of the importance of mode shift. So at the heart of our overall strategy, which is obviously has multiple benefits, but from an air quality perspective is really important in terms of reducing emissions, is increasing the mode share for walking, cycling and public transport use to 80%. And then making sure that the work that we do in terms of the public transport fleet, so I talked earlier about buses, we've made great progress, but we also now need to electrify that fleet. We need to do the same in terms of taxis and private hire vehicles. Again, we've made great progress, but there's more work to do. And then we also need to ensure that the fleet as a whole, the remaining fleets of private vehicles, we need, and this very much aligns with national policy as well, which is quite exciting, is that we actually support its electrification or switch to other zero emission modes. And of course, in doing this is actually integral also not just to achieving what we want in terms of air quality, but also achieving the goal that we have in terms of net zero. And of course, you'll be aware that the Mayor has a very bold ambition around achieving net zero by 2030. We've been talking about the World Health Organization guidelines today. We actually want to meet the interim 10 microgram PM2.5 target by 2030 as well, as that puts us on a pathway to actually meeting the overall final 5 microgram and PM2.5 target that Simon was talking about earlier. So we know what we need to do. We know that what we've seen in the past is that in terms of for CO2 emissions is that we've seen a really strong pace of reduction from buildings and from other non-transport sources, whereas we've only seen a 7% reduction in the CO2 emissions from the transport system in London. So that we know that if we're going to achieve net zero, we need to do much more to continue to reduce emissions from transport. And that will deliver a really important health dividend by improving air quality. And I think for those of you who've read the Element Energy report, which has kind of set out the pathway that we have in terms of achieving net zero by 2030, you'll know that we need to achieve a 27% reduction in car vehicle kilometres travelled by 2030. You'll know that we also need to kind of increase the proportion of the remaining vehicle fleet that is zero emission to 46% by 2030. And then, of course, there'll still be some offsetting that will be needed to achieve net zero overall. But if we get on the pathway to meeting those targets, if we accelerate the action that we're taking in terms of things like mode shift, bus electrification, we can actually deliver really significant and meaningful benefits and improvement for Londoners.
Elliot, you've just gone through some brilliant ideas of what we need to do, and I know that this is a top priority for the Mayor, but let's not forget that, you know, and Simon mentioned this earlier, there's an elephant in the room, but this is a different elephant in the room, where we aren't in the crystal today, but if you were in the crystal, we would see something happening just across the road. Now, Silvertown Tunnel is going to be impacting our pollution levels. How are we going to reach net zero by 2030 when we're actually going to be building more roads? And this is going to be a massive problem for us if we are really serious about making sure that we're improving our air quality. How does the Mayor marry up with what these great things you've just talked about and then build another road?
So I think there's a couple of things to think about there. Obviously, the first thing is to think about the existing air quality impact of the Blackwall Tunnel, which is absolutely horrific, especially when you see closures of the Blackwall Tunnel, which happens frequently, I think something like up to 700 times a year. So therefore, putting in additional resilience and therefore putting in Silvertown Tunnel not only helps address that problem, but crucially, for the first time, enables us to actually put in place better public transport options using buses, regular, reliable service across the river, increasing connectivity, creating economic opportunity in that area. And of course, as we'll come on to talk about, I'm sure, around the role of charging, that it can play such a powerful role in actually making sure that we don't get increases in traffic, which can have some of the knock-on negative impacts that you might otherwise expect in terms of Silvertown. So I think that is an important bit of the context, but we've also got to remember that we've taken further action in terms of expanding the Ultra Low Emission Zone, and there's potentially other policy measures which we can actually also put in place to address some of the other challenges that we have with net zero, which might also continue to kind of make sure that London is on that trajectory to not only improving air quality, but also meeting net zero.
And how does the Mayor tackle the kind of the comms of this? Because if you're going to be a world leader, you know, he is projecting this image of being a world leader in terms of air pollution and projecting the fact that, you know, London is leading in these great initiatives. How does that work out in terms of your comms? I mean, this isn't great a story. You know, I'm building more roads and trying to reach net zero by 2030. I don't understand that.
I think if you look at the ambition of the measures that we put in place, things like the Ultra Low Emission Zone, we talked about the cleaner buses, we talked about the ambition in terms of taxes, we've got that overall target that we need to achieve in terms of mode shift. I think that the message is actually really strong and really clear about the direction of travel. What we're also trying to do is address specific problems in specific parts of London. So I was talking about the lack of public transport connectivity in that part of London, the lack of economic opportunity. You'll be fully aware, of course, about the number of opportunities to cross the bridge in West London as opposed to East London. All of these things are important things to address in the wider context of also, obviously, achieving these very ambitious targets that we have around net zero and, of course, protecting health through improving air quality.
Okay, well, I'm not going to go on about this, but there is going to be a rally on Saturday, and there's a lot of people in the area of Newham, particularly, who are going to be upset to a point where they are not going to be supporting the Mayor of London on this, and this is going to be a really difficult position for the Mayor. And if we are going to be, you know, needing the support of all Londoners on all these air pollution projects. That, you know, I think it's a real tragedy actually that this is happening. I know that Simon wants to come in at this point. Are you okay with that, Chair? Okay.
Thank you very much. I just, I'm also just like to echo your concern about Silvertown Tunnel. I do hear what Elliot says about the resilience benefits of putting another tunnel in, because anyone who's been through Blackwall Tunnel or waited in long queues will know some of the problems there. But this is in itself obviously a big carbon spending project. A lot of carbon will be used to create it. I'm concerned about the impacts while it's being built, so we really need very good PM 2.5 monitoring around that area. And if it does go ahead, we really need to have the strongest titanium, whatever they are, shielded protections to make sure that that we don't get worsening of local air quality and traffic impacts in that area. So I think there are a lot of issues, but thank you for letting me make a short intervention.
Does Ollie want to come in quickly?
Yeah, if the chair permits. I just on this, I think if the mayor is insistent on this tunnel going ahead, then I think we're really lacking any sort of positive vision about what this actually enables for everyone in London. So an example I give to people is just the state of Tower Bridge and how this is next to a World Heritage Site has been pummeled with traffic for so long. Tourists are penned in. Why, if we are insistent on building another tunnel and therefore increasing road capacity in the city, we should be reducing road capacity elsewhere for polluting vehicles and actually creating a more positive and selling more positive vision to Londoners of what that enables elsewhere. In addition to that, I think it's potentially going to be grossly unfair that East Londoners are going to be charged to cross the river. So, okay, we're creating an opportunity for you to reach employment and what have you, but you're going to have to pay for it. Whereas over in West London, we don't, and we're actually fixing bridges at no other cost to taxpayers. So I think there's a question there as well, depending where this actually goes, this intervention.
And Chair, if Ian can come in as well, thank you.
Yeah, look, let me confess, I have skin in this game. I've advised the coalition against the Silvertown Tunnel on many occasions. I think it's an error to build anything which is potentially going to induce traffic, so that you actually end up at the end of the day with 2 points of congestion within the city. And the other thing which concerns me about it is about social justice, that effectively this feels to me like it's a bypass in the middle of the city, serving boroughs in London with the lowest rates of car ownership, and also running through the very boroughs where we made those initial discoveries about the impact of air quality on children's stunted lung development. So I just think that you have to be very cautious here. And I worry a little bit whenever the policy benefits delivered through one action is titrated against another one to say we've created space, which will therefore allow us to deliver this. The negative impacts of this are within the margins that we've made with this other action. And so I would just like to represent that as somebody who lives near there, whose traffic burden will be increased by these schemes, the residents are very concerned about it. That is the case.
Thank you, Ian. And are you okay, Chair, if Sarah comes in? Thank you, Sarah.
Thanks so much. And thank you for raising Silvertown. I know it's an issue that a lot of people on this call and a lot of people in London are really passionate about. But I just wanted to add one thing to Ian's point there around induced demand. And I think and what you said about communications and what this looks like. And I think it's a very difficult position to hold where you're advocating for things like low traffic neighbourhoods, where you argue that when you close roads, you are reducing the sort of demand for cars there, and you're giving people the option to travel by any means, which is something that, I fully endorse and think is right and think is, up to date with what we understand about how roads work and how people travel, while on the other hand, building a new road that and then sort of arguing that that's not going to have the impact of increasing cars and increasing traffic. I think that by doing that, you really delegitimize the argument of why it's so important to restrict where cars can go and why it is so important to counteract induced demand. And that's a knock-on effect of road building programs that not only creates congestion, but also loses support for some of the measures that are really great that are going in to affect congestion elsewhere. So I think it's a very difficult tightrope to walk, and I don't think it's being walked effectively right now. I think it's damaging what's going on. So
thank you. I think you're quite aware that the Greens and Lib Dems have been echoing these thoughts that you've been saying for a while now. So thank you, panel, for clarifying and supporting actually a lot of what the campaigners have been saying about Silvertown Tunnel. And I'm sure there'll be a lot of you there on Saturday as well. So I'll see you then. I do want to just slightly touch on cargo bikes as well. I know that we're going to be talking about it later at the very end. But do you think that the Mayor's doing enough here in supporting initiatives that, for example, Fair City are doing, where they want to create clean air markets? Elliot, do you think we could do more here?
So I think this is a really interesting area. So we've already done some work supporting cargo bike deliveries through the Mayor's Air Quality Fund, where we've done supported local schemes to help businesses to actually deliver their goods locally using cargo bikes and maybe have access to a cargo bike service. There's also been some really innovative stuff that was also done in terms of taking services to people. So one of my favourite stories, lockdown obviously was a terrible time, but if you did want to have a cocktail, you could have that delivered to you by bike from various different bars. And I think people have really enjoyed it. And I think it's part of a wider holistic vision that we do need of the city in terms of actually how we do vital servicing and freight activity. And I do think, outside Union Street, which is the office where I'm based at the moment, you can see, for example, beer kegs being delivered by cargo bikes, really heavy, large things on these amazing bikes. And it's just absolutely brilliant about what is actually possible. And I think it's something that we do need to explore as part of our overarching approach to freight and servicing, which maybe Christina might want to say a little bit more on later on.
I do think that we are going to touch on that later, but thank you for talking about that, Elliot. My last question of this section is going to be on anti-engine idling campaigns that the Mayor's been doing. And Elliot, I know that this is something that the Mayor has supported. But what's the progress at the moment? And also, my main concern is this. So I've been part of a training course of getting people like myself who are councillors to get people to switch off their engines, which is fine. They will do it for a moment or two, but it's not becoming part of the culture of people to switch off their engines. The fining system isn't working. I don't know anyone who has been fined for having their engine on or idling. What's going wrong?
I think you've probably put your finger on the nail, if that's the phrase, on the kind of key issue in terms of really getting around behaviour change, which is around in terms of enforcement for when you do see people engine idling. It's very, very difficult for local authorities to take meaningful action because of the nature of how you have to issue warnings where you can actually and give people an opportunity to switch off their vehicle before you can actually take action. So clearly that's not going to be the most effective way. But what we can do, and where we always wanted to start with this, is around, first of all, raising awareness around engine idling. And I think that we've actually made some good headway with that. There's more to be done. And I think we talked about this a little last time in terms of how we can do additional work with the GLA fleets, for example. But one of the things that we've been able to support through the Mayor's Air Quality Fund is a pan-London engine idling project, which has 30 boroughs in the City of London involved in it. We've been able to reach through a kind of a comprehensive marketing campaign that was on radio, on billboards. The number of impressions that we've had is very, very high, and therefore the number of people who are starting to recognise that engine idling as a problem is starting to improve. And that's been really supported by some of the targeted individual work that's happened. So the 131 school workshops that have taken place, the work that's also happened, as you were talking about, in terms of supporting the boroughs to explore what they can do in terms of enforcement. So it might not be able to issue a fine, but if you can get the parking wardens to talk to people when they see engine idling activity taking place, that again supports that kind of education work. So I'd accept that there's definitely more that needs to take place, but we're starting to learn important lessons from the work that we've been doing and the marketing activity we've undertaken. It's something that we've been pushing in terms of having the right powers for a long time, and we'll continue to push that with government. And I think that this is an area where we can continue to make progress.
I think I've taken too much of your time, Chair, so I'll leave it there, but I think there's some other Assembly members who want to come in. Thank you very much, panel.
Thank you very much, Assembly Member Bokhari. And removing my chair's hat for a moment, I just want to notice how striking it is that from a panel of experts, nearly every single one has expressed deep concern about the Silvertown Tunnel, and I hope the Mayor will hear that loud and clear. Putting my chair hat back on, Assembly Member Devenish.
Thank you. Actually, he stole my point, but I'm going to make it anyway because it's such an important point. I don't entirely agree with Elliot in terms of good marketing is important, but you need some real enforcement on idling. And TfL do have a team of marshals. Of course, the boroughs lead on this, but can you give us some figures, Elliot, or write to us in terms of how many marshals, TfL staff you've got working on this, how many hours a week? Because I agree with Hina. I actually only know one person who's been fined, which isn't great. And I'm a great believer in carrots rather than sticks on some things, but here I think we've got to have some sticks. No good just talking all the fine words that everybody's talking about this morning. If TfL themselves haven't got marshals going out there and hitting people where it hurts, we've got, idling has got to be socially unacceptable in the way that drink driving wasn't and now is, or smoking, bluntly. And unless we can actually do more than a bit of marketing, nothing's going to change. So I agree with my Lib Dem colleague in this instance. And Elliot, what more? Can you please come back on what TfL are practically doing, not just some marketing, but some enforcement, please? Thank you.
So absolutely happy to come back with a bit more detail, but something I can refer to is that TfL have done some very good work in terms of addressing engine idling from some of their own fleets, particularly their bus fleets, particularly when they're on stands and outside bus garages. And there's been a number of local issues which have been rumbling away for quite some time, which I know TfL have taken action to address. On the wider point about marshals, I'll take that away and happy to write to the committee with an update.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. That's several times recently you've agreed with Lib Dems and Green colleagues. You're going to get a reputation, Tony. Assembly Member Sheikh.
Thanks, Chair, and good morning to the panel. Thank you so much for joining us. So I just wanted to move us on to talking about active travel, and just begin by asking Elliot, to what extent do you think walking and cycling can reduce the number of car trips that we have in the city, and how can the Mayor encourage Londoners to support these initiatives?
So I think it's a really good point around active travel. I think just going back to the strategic approach I set out a little while ago in terms of what we've done in the strategies in terms of healthy streets and the crucial role that getting mode shift actually plays in achieving the overall emission reductions that we need. We need more people to be walking and cycling. And of course, walking can be built into lots of other journeys. Perhaps, rather than take the bus to the tube station, you walk to the tube station. So you can kind of so what we really need to do is try and make it as easy and straightforward as possible and as attractive as possible for walk and cycle, bearing in mind that we don't just get emissions benefits from this, you also get a whole range of other benefits, particularly around the health benefits of tackling obesity. So in answer to your question, clearly it's very, very important. We've made some significant progress in terms of encouraging people to walk and cycle. And that includes particularly targeted action that's happened, for example, around school streets. That's a particular population we really want to encourage to walk and cycle more where we can. And of course, I realise this is a bit more of a complicated subject in many ways, but through the pandemic, we've also seen a range of interactions through the Street Space programme, which have enabled additional space to be allocated for walking and cycling. And some of those schemes are being taken forward on a more permanent basis. There's also been, and I realise again that there's a range of views around low traffic neighbourhoods, but when done well, they can also play an important role in creating a more attractive space where people can walk and cycle safely. So I think it's absolutely vital in terms of the overall strategy and in terms of the amount of infrastructure that's going in both through street space, but also before then in terms of things like cycling infrastructure. I think the Mayor's made some really significant progress in that.
Okay, that's really helpful to hear, Elliot. And I think I'd just ask you to build on that a little bit in regards to, so I know that recently the Mayor's Office or the Deputy Mayor's Office for Planning were kind of putting out a consultation on the draft LPG around sustainable transport, walking and cycling. So in regards to that kind of London Plan guidance on how to encourage local authorities to kind of embed active travel in their areas, what do you anticipate that having an impact in terms of improving and increasing walking and cycling across the city?
So again, I think the advantage of the London Plan is that what it enables you to do is take a bit more of a coordinated approach. And we obviously have these London-wide targets, very ambitious in terms of the mode shift that we need to achieve in terms of the 80%. We've been talking about net zero in terms of 2030, so therefore there is an implicit need to also accelerate that action. I think what we can do is I think was it Simon, someone earlier was reminding us, of course, that TfL actually only controls about 5% of the road network in total, those busiest red routes. So if you are going to see this continued support and investment in cycling and walking, and is making that as safe and attractive as possible, the boroughs are absolutely critical partners. I don't think it's just a case about what happens through the London plan. I think TfL also does fantastic work more generally in terms of working with the boroughs and trying to encourage them in this direction. I think Simon did touch on earlier something which is a really important point, and a bit of feedback that we're getting consistently from the boroughs now, that currently, as a result of not having a final settlement in place with the government in terms of TfL, there is no certainty about the funding and support that can be provided to boroughs to actually put in place this infrastructure or to make it permanent. And I think that that is going to end up being a significant challenge for us if we don't get a long-term resolution to that, and we don't have the funding that we need to support boroughs to take action in this space.
That's great, Elliot. Thank you. And I couldn't agree more with you. I hope the government's listening. Ollie, would you like to come in because your hand's up?
Yeah, if you don't mind. On the walking and cycling, what could the mayor be doing to make it easier to walk and cycle and encourage more walking and cycling? I had a couple of thoughts on that. One is not rolling back the congestion charge at weeknights in central London. I mean, central London is one of the best areas to be encouraging more walking and cycling, and I think that's going to have a detrimental impact, so I'll look to that. The mayor, we've talked about the mayor's responsibility for London's red routes, you know, the busiest roads in London. Elliot says they only represent 5% of the road network, which is obviously correct, but they are the most hostile roads and quite often the barrier to get in the way of someone's journey from cycling from one direction to another. So there are immediate steps that can be taken to reduce that hostility. One is around reducing the speed limit to 20 miles an hour, which we all know is a much safer limit for urban areas. You know, I had an experience yesterday going along Chelsea Embankment. It's now enforced 20 mile an hour, and you actually really feel the difference when you're cycling next to the traffic. It makes a huge difference. And, you know, there are plans in foot to start to transform these roads, but we look at an example like Vauxhall Gyratory. It's 6 lanes wide. It was consulted on back in 2015 to change that. It's not going to complete till 2025. So like the pace that we're going at to try and match these roads with the vision that is set out in the strategy isn't necessarily coming along so fast. And that relates back to pollution levels as well, right? You know, so the recent report from the mayor shows that actually 30% of the red route network is still exceeding the legal levels for air pollution. So I definitely think there's a lot more that could be done there at the moment.
Maybe just to come back very quickly on some of those points, I think that they're really important. I think Ollie has also highlighted something which perhaps I should have said around 20 mile an hour speed limits. And I think what's really interesting is that, and again, this is down to that partnership working with boroughs and also the leadership that boroughs show on their own initiative as well, of course, is that over half of London's roads now have that 20 mile an hour speed limit. I think that there is also, to Ollie's point, which I think again is a very good one about the red routes and about other, not just the red routes, but other busier roads. I think having that protected or other dedicated cycling infrastructure is really important. And of course, what we've seen over recent years are just tripling of the size of the network of protected cycle routes, and with an additional 100 kilometres of new and upgraded cycleways delivered during the pandemic. So clearly there is a lot of action taking place, but I go back to my point that I was making earlier. If we want to sustain that improvement, what we really need to see is proper support from government in terms of a long-term TfL settlement.
Yeah, thank you so much, Elliot, and Ollie, thank you also for your comments. I think we need to just, the role, I guess, of many of the parts that make up how we kind of shape London is having people push for more, better and quickly, and we're all investing in that on the Environment Committee, so I think your contribution was very helpful. Just to add, like, the final question back to you, Elliot, really, and I think, to be honest, you've already covered this a lot, so feel free to kind of just summarise it and draw on previous answers. But what impact has the Mayor's initiative and strategies had on reducing air pollution so far, and what improvements can be anticipated on health as a consequence?
So I think, again, this, you know, the reason we do all this work, although of course there are multiple benefits from an air quality perspective, really has to be translated into how it improves and protects people's health. So we've heard some of the, you know, fantastic figures in terms of the reduction in the number of schools which are located in areas which exceed legal limits. We've also heard about the overall population reduction in terms of the number of people exposed in the areas that they live in terms of these limits. And of course, it's vital that we remember that when we look at those schools that were exceeding, or we look at the people who were living in areas which exceeded legal limits, those were disproportionately from some of the poorest and most vulnerable communities, from Black, Asian, minority ethnic communities. And this is fundamentally an issue of social justice. But I think what's quite positive is, in terms of the analysis that we've done, when you look at the package of policies that we've put in place, by 2050, we expect that that's going to result in around 300,000 cases of disease that would otherwise have occurred, which would have been caused by air pollution, to be avoided. It would have resulted in 1 million fewer new air quality related hospital admissions. And in terms of the cost saving to the NHS as a result of that, that's expected to save something in the order of £5 billion. So, you know, hugely valuable in terms of the health outcomes of this work. But and I think Simon again and Ian have kind of articulated this really, really well. We can't rest on the laurels of that's fantastic, but there is still hundreds of thousands of cases of disease being caused in London as a result of long-term exposure to air pollution. And there are obviously wider costs for the disease which we aren't addressing, which are being absorbed by the NHS. So there's a real case for action here in terms of not only protecting health, but also reducing costs to the health system. And as I said earlier, if we do this right, we can also create this massive economic opportunity as well.
That's great. Thank you very much, Elliot. I'm Madam Chair.
Thank you very much. I believe Assembly Member Best has some supplementaries, and then we're going to move on to ULEZ. So Christina, again, thank you for your patience. It seemed a while ago that I said we'll get to it. Assembly Member Best.
Thanks, Zach. And yeah, and I'll be trying to be brief, but what I think is really important to talk about when we're talking about increasing active travel is we're talking from a prism of people with the privilege of time. And I think that is the most important factor we have to remember is if you are essentially dropping kids to school, nursery, and you've got to be in work by 9, you sometimes physically have no other option. And it's very hard for you to worry about, you know, air quality and your kids' health and your health for the long term when you're worried about how you're putting food on the table tonight and tomorrow, which is essentially what so many Londoners a situation, especially in outer London again, a situation so many Londoners are in. And so to address that, it's a wider picture of increasing active travel where, you know, how do we encourage schools to have, you know, more breakfast clubs and open earlier, you know, encourage more flexible working throughout our city so people are less stressed about what time they're getting into work. And all these are kind of convening powers of the mayor, right? You know, of course he can't absolutely do this. And, you know, and how do we build those business hubs across the city so people aren't having to commute far? So that's a long-term picture. But I just always think if your family's economic well-being relies on you literally having to go, you know, make a journey, it's not about, oh, let's make the roads nicer or, you know, for active travel. You need something that will give you time because so many people in the city don't have the privilege of time to choose how they travel. And that's a massive problem we have when we're encouraging active travel. And I want to remember that. And I'd like the panel to talk about how we address some of those wider barriers to active travel.
If I just come in first, I'm sure other people might want to come in as well. I think they're all really important points. And I think you're right that we need to make sure that we're thinking about this through the prism of every Londoner's perspective and the challenges that they may face. And as you mentioned, some people perhaps being particularly time poor or having the challenge of juggling a complicated set of working requirements with family. So, you know, completely understand all of that. And some of the ideas that you just set out there, Emma, I think are really important in terms of how we think about some of these things holistically. I think this is where perhaps some of the opportunities that do come out with in terms of how we think about the economic strategy, how we think about the London plan to kind of think about how we, you know, do some land use planning across the city, about how we make sure we have the right infrastructure and opportunities, you know, spread across the city are really, really important ways of also addressing that. And I think that, you know, you're absolutely right that we need to think about this holistically rather than just about active travel on its own.
I think there's an aspect of making sure people have realistic understandings of how much time different modes of transport take as well. You know, I'm not out of London, but I'm not in London either. I'm about 6 or 7 miles from the city centre. And for me, taking my bike to work is by far the fastest way for me to get into the office. And I'd never thought about cycling before the pandemic. I thought I was the kind of person who would never, ever do it. And I've been amazed at how fast I can get to different places. And particularly when you're thinking about people who are doing what you've talked about there, Emma, which is trip chaining. You know, a lot of our public transport systems are designed with the commute into the office in mind, and they're not focused around, you know, in general women's journeys, to be blunt about it, where you're often, you know, you're doing a few things in a row. You're going to the school, and then you might be going to the shops, and then you might be going in to check on a relative, and then you're going into the office. And that can be often really difficult to do by public transportation, and, you know, too expensive to do by car for a lot of families. But making sure that people have that protected infrastructure and have that safe infrastructure and access to things like cycling could actually make those journeys a lot faster. And, you know, I agree with you. I don't think anyone is going to be making big fundamental changes to how they get around because it's the right thing to do or because it's nice. I think they're going to do it because it's cheaper, because it's faster, and because they feel healthier when they do it. And I think there's a role for us to play in helping people sort of look at those different things and think, you know, when you factor in parking, when you factor in traffic, when you factor in all of these things, is it actually faster to get there by car? Or if we could make this feel safe for you, are you going to get everything done much faster? And then you can, you know, you can skip the gym.
Assemblyman Best, it's over to you again for a section on ULEZ. Yeah,
and thank you, Sarah, for those answers, and Elliot as well. Well, that was really good. Christina, yeah, as Zach promised, I think, like I said a while ago now, to you, please. Just wanted to know what particularly TfL and we as a committee can learn from the reported high level of compliance with the ultra low emission zone, or the expanded ultra low emission zone, maybe.
Thank you. Yeah, so first thing to say really about the high levels of compliance is that we are really, really delighted by them. Really happy to report that they are as high as they are, and higher really than we expected them to be at this stage. And I think we can learn a lot from that. I think particularly when we're looking at these kind of big, bold policies. And I think what we can take from it is the importance of public dialogue, the importance of having a well understood scheme, of having kind of consultation and engagement that means that people really understand what's happening, how it will affect them, what the alternatives are, how they can take action, and having time and support to be able to do that so that people are able to take action, change their behaviour in a way that helps us reduce air pollution, but also helps them to avoid a charge. I think there's a lot to be learned in terms of scheme development, consultation and engagement. And I think in terms of support as well, so I think we've touched briefly before on the scrappage schemes, but having that £61 million worth of scrappage funds also enabled people, from low-income households, disabled Londoners, small businesses, charities, to understand what the scheme might mean for them, plan ahead and actually scrap their vehicles and either upgrade to a cleaner vehicle. But as we've said, that's not the kind of ultimate end goal either, that everybody just has a cleaner personal metal box on the roads. And that as part of those scrappage schemes, we did provide people with a kind of package of alternatives, looking at whether you could have kind of free cycle hire, or a deal with a car club, which might help you move away from private car ownership. So I think all of those things are learnings that we can take. And I think we also kind of continuing to see compliance grow. So there's a lot, I think, that we can learn from the schemes and the way that we've implemented them to date.
Sorry, I just want to confirm, Christina, what are you saying was offered as part of the scrappage scheme?
So for the low income and disabled scrappage scheme, the car and motorcycle scrappage scheme, which was available for people on low incomes and disabled Londoners, there was a package, and I won't be able to recite it all perfectly off the top of my head, but I can send you those details. But it's on the website. There was a kind of package of there were car clubs, cycle hire. I'm trying to remember what else there was, and I'm failing, unfortunately. But there was we had kind of worked with partners to make sure that there were alternatives to car use incentivised as part of that scrappage payment, so that people didn't feel that they had to replace their vehicle with a compliant one, and that we were supporting them in making different, more sustainable choices.
And was TfL travel credits part of that package or an option?
No, I guess the money part of it was the scrappage payment.
Sorry, I know there's other people that want to come in. I just want to say, do you think that's possibly a learning then, that TfL travel credits are a good thing to put as part of these scrappage schemes if you were to do it again?
So it's definitely something that we want to think about. So what we really want to do with these schemes is make sure that people are kind of supported as far as possible to switch to a more sustainable journey choice, and that is an attractive and a viable proposition for them. Part of how we can do that on our own services is definitely part of that. And as I say, we would already kind of looked at cycle hire as part of that, but absolutely we can think about how it might work more broadly as part of either future scrappage schemes or future kind of road user charging schemes. We can think about smarter ways to do that kind of incentivisation piece.
Thanks. I can see Simon and Sarah want to come in. So, Chair, shall I hand over to Simon?
Yeah, I think Sarah's hand was an old hand.
Sarah, then, sorry.
Mine was an old hand also, so.
Oh.
No, Simon wants to come in. Simon. You're on mute, sorry. He's struggling to come off mute there, we'll give you a moment.
Shall I turn your camera off, Simon. It offered its easy to come on for some odd reason.
Yeah. Okay, right. Thanks, Tony. Right, perhaps I'll just leave the camera off for this intervention then quickly. I think one point and then a question of clarification or guidance from the chair, please. I think one of the best things about the ultra low emission zone, and let's not forget that it was actually proposed in 2014 by the previous mayor, the now Prime Minister. So it has been a long time in coming. I called for it as far back as 2008, a Berlin style, in a low emission scheme. But I think one of the most valuable things it's done is stopped people buying diesel vehicles, because then you don't have to pay any scrappage. And I think what really struck me when the ULEZ was expanded was that we had car showrooms saying they hadn't sold a diesel vehicle for 2 or 3 years. And I think that's it's by setting out these big long-term visions where we're talking about zero air emissions, because 80% of the climate and air quality emissions come from the same source, i.e. combustion. We do need people to stop buying things which emit things to the air. So that has certainly been a big advantage of it, which is the question of guidance, if I may. I'd like to make an intervention about emission-based road charging, which is perhaps my most important intervention today, but I just request guidance from the chair as to whether I should ask to do it now or later on. Thank you.
No, here is fine if you want to outline it.
Thank you. I'll just put my hand down. So I'll do this as briefly as possible. London has a sort of a mixture of blunt schemes. I've been complaining about this since the congestion charge when I started campaigning in 2006. We have the congestion charging zone, we have the ultra low emission zone, we have the low emission zone. Whenever I do interviews, I end up having to try and check what all the dates are and all the rules are. We have these big blunt instruments where if you even travel 100 yards into a zone at the wrong time of day or any time of day, often you have a charge. No, this is really quite primitive. It's in June 2015, I sat down with Isabel Dedring, who was Boris's head of transport, who I have a great admiration for. And we literally designed, over a cup of tea in her office on a Friday afternoon, something which I will call emission-based road charging. And that would be a cleverer scheme, which would simplify and get rid of these blunt instruments. So it would have 4 elements. People would pay depending on the time of day and where they are, and the quantity and quality of fuel that vehicles burn. The technology, there are so many different technologies that could be used to achieve that. Isabel's view back then was that this sort of scheme could be introduced within 2 years. I mean, it would probably be 3 years by the time the proper consultations had been done. But within 2 or 3 years, you could bring in this sort of scheme. People would be no worse off in terms of privacy than they are at the moment, for sure, because if you drive around in London, there are cameras, and actually you could have a very simple scheme, which basically just added up points for time of day, place, quantity and quality of fuel you burnt. With the move to electric vehicles, the government will be losing vehicle excise duty. We really do need to come up with a system which replaces VED, vehicle excise duty, with some other form of charging for use of roads. And I would like to see this ultra low emission zone replaced by emission-based road charging. My big ask today would be, really ideally, I would like to, if I had the opportunity, I'd like to bang the mayor's head together with the government's head and say, let's sort out this TfL refinancing. Let's give the mayor control of or the funds from vehicle excise duty within London. And let's get from the mayor a commitment to introduce this bigger, stronger, smarter, fairer scheme, which would be pollution-based, but would also take account of other factors. And the beauty about such a scheme is that you could actually pay people to walk or cycle. You could pay people to walk or cycle by getting the balance of this scheme right. And I would really ask that the mayor or Seb or Shirley call Isabel Dedring and ask her how to do this quickly, because other cities are looking at these sorts of schemes well advanced, and London risks being stuck and falling behind. Thank you.
Thank you. I can see we've got other indications. I'm just going to ask for people to be brief, particularly if they're talking about road charging. Again, without my environment chair hat on, it's something I completely support, but it is the Transport Committee and we're the Environment Committee, so just brief, succinct answers would be great. And then I'll hand back to Assemblyman Best to carry on her questions. Holly.
Yeah, so I think what we've learned from the compliance of the ULEZ, firstly, I was actually very surprised at the high levels of compliance with the cars, and like the cynic in me would maybe say, are we actually capturing all the car journeys in that zone? Because we do see the van compliance being much lower than that. We've also seen, just to echo what Simon was saying, yes, Londoners are ditching diesel cars far quicker than the rest of the UK as a response to the ULEZ. And the most important thing when it comes to achieving compliance with ULEZ is the time that you give people notice as these standards are changing. And that's what really concerns me now about the future, is that the mayor started to open up this discussion about the future of the ULEZ through that net zero report. But we need to know now where we're headed, right? We've got other cities in Europe, for example, Brussels, I'll give you an example. They've said 2030, no more diesel cars are going to be circulating in our city. It's that sort of time frame that will enable even greater compliance with these schemes. And we have seen, though, that an increase in petrol cars being registered in the city at the same time as we're seeing a decrease in diesel cars as well, which does have ramifications for net zero.
Ian, thank you.
Well, I'd just like to second the need for emission-based charging. Actually, we need national emission-based charging, which will get rid of the rather patchwork network of clean air zone actions we have in the United Kingdom. But the other point is that the UK won't meet its net zero objectives by 2050 unless it tackles the greenhouse gas emissions from the transport sector. That's currently 27%. Most of it is actual personal vehicles, yeah? So irregardless of whether we like the ULEZ or not, it's coming as part of standard government policy, because otherwise we do not tackle that major contribution and we won't meet our net zero objectives, and we're committed to doing it anyway.
Thank you. Assemblymember Best. Thanks for your patience.
Thanks. So I think one of the biggest issues that many in the panel know, but I have issues with the ULEZ, and that's not the idea of the ULEZ. I agree entirely with that. It's the rollout, and it's the way in which it's left behind some of the most vulnerable and poorest and isolated them in poor public transport zones. And one of the main reasons for that is to come back to this scrappage scheme. So I just wanted to ask Christina quickly, you talked about that briefly. As far as I'm aware, only a third of applications were ever paid out.
Okay, so I may be able to find those figures quickly, but essentially the number of applications received, we then work through them to understand whether they're eligible applications, accept the ones that are, and then the payments are made. What I will say is that those schemes have fully paid out. So we had huge numbers of people applying for them, and all of that money has gone to people to scrap their vehicles and support them in support of the schemes. We would love to have had more money to support more people. And I think, if the government wanted to contribute to a scrappage fund for London, as with other cities, then we would be delighted to be able to extend that and have more payments.
Or perhaps the mayor could, from his business rate reserve that we identified, would be a really good place for him to use the money for a scrappage scheme for a big capital project like this. The mayor could actually do more in terms of scrappage scheme. And actually, we could have done more if perhaps we'd used credits instead of payouts, couldn't we?
So I think, as we've explained, we did try to put together a package of alternatives as part of the car and motorcycle scrappage scheme. And we did, as I say, have a high number of applications, work them through. They weren't all applicable. Some of them dropped out as part of the, as they moved through the process. But we have used that 61 million to support people on the lowest incomes from disabled households, in small businesses and from charities to either change their vehicles to a cleaner vehicle or to find another form of travelling supported by some of our incentivised alternatives. So I think if we were, again, people have started to talk about future road user charging schemes, and to pick up briefly on Simon's points, we are looking at a more sophisticated scheme that could replace and integrate the congestion charge ULEZ, so it would, as he says, account for time of day, emissions, distance driven, area, that kind of thing. So a single, more integrated scheme. That will take some time, I think, probably a few more years. And in order to do something more quickly, the Mayor's asked us to look at what further emissions-based road users charging schemes we could introduce by May 2024. And I think if any of those approaches that we might look to adopt then do include further expansion of a ULEZ, then we would expect that to include further scrappage payments. And I think lessons learned from scrappage this time round will certainly help us inform those future scrappage schemes if indeed we end up with a scheme that requires scrappage and a scrappage fund.
Thanks. Because the next, I think Simon touched on it briefly, was the diesel vehicles, and Ollie as well mentioned it, but the fact is people still did buy vehicles that will, perhaps in May 2024, need to pay a charge again. And I think one of the big things that's happened this time is knowing, and like Ollie said, that pipeline of what may possibly be coming in, because we've just paid out, as he said, £61 million, which has left 2/3 of the people that applied for that scrappage without anything to help them. So incentives in further, we've already paid out this money, where we're again going to say we might need to pay out some more money to help the people that just took that money beforehand because they didn't know the pipeline of where we're going. They may have already bought a diesel vehicle, they may have already bought a non-compliant vehicle. So how do we lay out that pipeline much clearer? And to make sure that we're not, do you understand what I'm trying, respending the same money?
Yeah, I can give you some reassurance on that. So within the approaches that we've talked about, as I'm sure you're all aware, we've looked at a number of approaches, including a kind of straight extension of ULEZ as it is with the current standards. And in that kind of scenario, if you were to have another scrappage scheme, it would be on the same basis that vehicle standards would be the same. It would just be for people who would be newly affected by those schemes. So it wouldn't be paying out to the same people because the standard would be the same. So the people who applied the first time would have been affected by it in London. And if anybody would be newly affected, there would be a new opportunity to apply for scrappage because it may apply to them now, where it didn't before. Some of the other approaches we looked at included having a lower clean air charge. But that wouldn't, we talked about that as being a kind of lower level charge, and it wouldn't be at that kind of £12.50 level. But I understand your point about needing to have clarity on those future schemes as quickly as possible. So we are working through those assessments now so that we can be clearer about which of those schemes we think might be viable to take forward. Take your point that the sooner we're able to give that kind of work through that assessment and narrow it down, that will give people further reassurance. But it wouldn't be spending the same money twice, and it wouldn't, in terms of scrappage, that would be part of the ULEZ style scheme, would be where you'd look to have those kind of scrappage funds.
So I guess was there anything else you would add to what more can be done to increase compliance to help people be compliant in future with the ULEZ?
So I think that the two parts, so the compliance, I think there's kind of two bits of it. One is that actually, if you have lower volumes of vehicles, so it goes back to the kind of two-pronged approach we've been talking about this morning, that the first thing we want to do is to make sure that there are really attractive, viable alternatives to private car use, so that people don't need to drive their cars. And so if they have a non-compliant vehicle, they're able to use another mode. So first of all, it's us being able to provide those alternatives, and that goes back to the importance of having a sustainable funding situation and being able to invest in those alternatives. And then around the actual vehicle compliance, I think, as we've said, the kind of scrappage schemes have been really important for that, but also the lead-in times, the messaging, working with stakeholders and helping them to prepare.
Thank you. And I think we covered this as well, but just to say, in any future scheme, will you, and they've done it successfully in the West Midlands and with their clean air zone, will you consider doing a travel credit scheme?
Yeah, absolutely. We'll look at the best way that we can kind of use it all kind of holistically to make sure that people are able to use those other services. So yeah, we will consider.
Thanks. And just finally from me, are there any new plans for new scrappage schemes in London linked to reduced transport emissions? And if so, would they focus on LTDs and Hdvs?
So we don't have any new plans for scrappage at the moment in terms of the current schemes. As I said, if we do move forward with another scheme in future that would involve some kind of ULEZ expansion, then I think we would expect to see some scrappage options as part of that, which I would expect would continue to include LGVs and Hdvs as they did previously.
Thank you, Assemblymember Best. I believe Elliot wants to come in there too.
Yeah, just one extra point which I thought might be helpful. So in terms of scrappage and the, obviously Christina spoke about the fact that there have been quite generous amounts that have gone from government to other parts of the country. So 100 million plus in Manchester, I think something around 40 million pounds in Birmingham. And I just think it's worth noting, this goes to the point I think either Ollie or Simon, someone made at the beginning around VED, which is really important, is that Londoners are paying or certain Londoners with certain diesel vehicles are paying a VED surcharge in London, which then goes towards a National Clean Air Fund pot, which is then paying for these additional the additional support that these other cities are getting. And I think part of the frustration that we have is Londoners are contributing to that pot of funding to help clean up vehicle fleets and help people to meet these new standards, and yet London isn't receiving any money from that pot from national government, and instead the mayor is having and has obviously prioritised £61 million of funding for it. But if that was to be matched by government from this pot, then I think that would enable us to do more in terms of supporting more businesses, more low-income Londoners, more disabled people to actually transition to cleaner vehicles, or in the future, as you were saying, as well, around potentially to explore how we could do more innovative things with the scrappage fund as well.
Thank you, Elliot.
Sorry, can I just quickly, Chair, just ask Elliot whether he would advocate for using some of the business rate reserve to expand a further scrappage scheme, because we know we can do that, and I'm sure he wouldn't advocate for us getting the same level of funding as other cities that have received that clean air fund, because we would actually be the losers.
So I don't really think it's probably for me to offer an opinion in terms of whether we use the business rates funding. That's probably for other people at City Hall to make those decisions.
Thank you. I'm going to hand over in a moment to Assemblymember Cooper. Just before I do, Christina, I just want to clarify one thing. I know that I just spoke about the difference between Environment and Transport Committee, but Simon spoke so articulately about road user charging. I just want to dive in there a little bit. The Mayor has now said that this is something he's seriously considering, but the phrase he was using was by the end of the decade at the latest. But Centre for London did a report in 2018 that said the technology that we need to do this, and as Simon says, privacy needs to be baked in at the beginning and it needs to be genuinely fair, is ready now. So could you help me clarify what the delay is? Because it's 2022 and the Mayor says often we've got an air pollution crisis and a climate emergency, so it seems strange to wait 8 years.
Yep. So I don't think that 8 years was a kind of target date. I think the Element Energy report identified that you would need to have such a scheme in place by the end of the decade. And so the request of the Mayor to us is twofold. One, can we work up a future scheme? He hasn't asked us to work up to be delivered by a date, but can we work up that more a scheme which makes more sophisticated use of technology in the way that we've been discussing? So
we've lost you.
We will do that. That will.
Sorry to interrupt, Christina. We lost you temporarily. So would you mind just repeating your last kind of couple of points? I really want to check that we've got it.
Yep.
Thank you.
Sure. So I'm not sure where you lost me, but so the Mayor's request has been twofold. One, that we look at the future next generation integrated scheme. It is likely that that will take longer than something like a kind of expansion of what we already have, where we already have kind of contracts and back office systems. I agree that the technology isn't kind of a million miles away, but it is. We would still be the first city, certainly a city of the size and complexity of London, to introduce such a new and complex scheme. We've talked about the importance of bringing the public with you, people understanding what it's going to be, how it's going to affect them. So I think there are the kind of two-pronged approach really is for us to be starting in earnest now. So this isn't like, oh, we'll do one scheme in the short term and then we'll turn our attention to the longer term scheme. It's starting kind of looking at them both in parallel, saying, what can we do really quickly to address this urgent challenge whilst keeping the focus on we want to move to this more sophisticated scheme as soon as we can, really. So it's not a target date at the end of the decade. That's when it needs to be done by, in terms of the Element Energy report and the pathway.
Thank you. I've got Simon and then Ollie.
Thank you. I just want to say I just don't hear the urgency in this. You know, I've given levels of pollution around in Brixton Road, Putney High Street and so on. I mean, I'm shocked to hear what I've just heard. You know, Isabel and I sat down in 2015, 7 years ago, nearly 7 years ago. You know, I can't believe that TfL hasn't done this sort of work or have it quite well advanced. So I'm really quite shocked by what I've heard. Thank you. We need emission-based road charging within the next 2 or 3 years.
Thank you.
Can I come back on that quickly? Yeah, so I think it's been in the MTS since 2016. It's the first MTS which has had the policy specifically catering for developing such a scheme in it. So that was published in 2018, and that's the first time that's been there, and we have been working on it, which is why we're in a position to be able to know what we're likely to be able to do now. I think this is the first time that we've had a clear steer from a mayor to say, I would like you to work up this scheme, please. So we are moving forward that quickly. As you say, we do need to move with urgency, which is why I think we've been asked to do two things. One, do something more as urgently as we can, and the second, to make sure that hot on the heels of that, we are looking at how we can develop a more sophisticated scheme. So we are doing both of those things with a sense of urgency, and I'm sorry if I didn't convey the urgency, but that's certainly the way that we are working.
Thank you. Ollie?
I agree with Simon to some extent. Like that steer could have been given in 2018 when the transport strategy came out, quite frankly. I am a little torn because I think this report that's just come out on net zero and the mayor talking about needing to reduce car kilometres by 27% is, you know, it should be applauded, because I'm not seeing many other city leaders kind of really coming out with that level of detail. But I also want to flag to the Assembly that if we're talking about ULEZ and what to do next with that, and if there is, you know, any sort of expansion about what is actually done at the moment, the latest report from the expansion showed there was only a 1% reduction, if that, in vehicle kilometres in the expanded zone. So it doesn't quite, ULEZ doesn't quite equate to what is necessary to achieve that net zero report. So I think that plays into this sense of urgency that we're not necessarily seeing what's coming next.
Thank you very much. Handing over to Assembly Member Cooper.
Oh, I thought we'd never get there. Good Lord, it's almost noon and we're only halfway through section 3. I wanted to ask if there are any other incentives that are in the pipeline or can be considered by the Mayor to explore, which would encourage a reduction in vehicle use. I mean, we've all made it quite clear that, you know, this is something that needs to be urgently happening. One way is to install street space schemes. One way is to have low traffic neighbourhoods. One way is to bring in things like the T-charge, the ultra low emission zone. But is there anything else that can be done? I certainly know that you know, there was some incentives that came in, for example, salary sacrifice to encourage people to purchase bicycles, you know, which was through work. Is that something that is still going on? Can the Mayor, you know, do encouragement of that? What about cycling proficiency? Because one of the other things that helps people get out and do active travel is not just feeling safe because of physical structures in the road, but also feeling their bike is set up for their height and size and weight, and that they feel confident about being on the road. Christina, I'll start with you, and then if anyone else wants to come in, I'll be happy to hear. I mean, there may be loads of other things as well. I'm just picking those out.
Thank you. But I think you've picked out the really big ones. I think the most important thing we can do is invest in attractive alternatives. People aren't going to abandon their cars if they don't have a kind of competitive way of making that journey in a way that feels safe and comfortable and kind of competes on journey time. So, and having that kind of certainty around funding, which means that you've got a safe, clean, fast bus service, which means that you can kind of get to where you need to go without getting in a car, making sure that we have lower levels of traffic to support those quicker bus journeys, to support more road space reallocation for walking and cycling, and having a really efficient road network. That's going to be really important, and I think that can't be underestimated. So those incentives in terms of making sure that you have the alternatives there ready for people to use and that they're attractive is the first thing. And then there's disincentives to car use we've touched on as well, in terms of road user charging schemes. There are parking policies, kind of making car use a less attractive option, as well as trying to make the others more attractive. And recognising, I think, in kind of picking up what Emma said as well, that the MTS target is for 80% of trips to be made by sustainable modes, and that recognises that 20%, there will still be times where the car is the right choice for people, and there will be different people in different circumstances that will need to use the car at some point. And it's not about trying to make that more difficult. It's just saying that in a city of this size, the more people that can be using sustainable travel, the best it is for everybody who lives here. I think the point you make about cycling and training and what are the other kind of softer measures that you can do around that are really important. The training one, I think, as well, is really important. Bikeability courses do some of that kind of what used to be, when I was a kid, was cycle proficiency training. And they're also trying to work with communities which are less well represented in cycling. And I was recently at a big event where we were trying to engage with different communities to talk about the diversity of people using active modes, because it's still the case that lots of people in London don't feel like it is for them, and we need to do a lot of work, I think, around that. So I think there's some of the areas that we could usefully focus on, but that diversity point, I think, is really powerful.
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly still, even for people who've picked up cycling, you know, that they get out onto the cycle superhighway to get to work, and then they find that they're actually being sort of berated by other cyclists who fit into the sort of, you know, the traditional mammal, the middle-aged man in Lycra, who wants to go at sort of 20 miles an hour and push all the other cyclists out of the way, which I think is also a problem. So I think not just proficiency, but also, I mean, there is an issue about some cyclists being rude to other cyclists as well as potentially to pedestrians, and we've all seen that. So I'd like to see that tackled as well. But just to speak to something else that I think Emma was raising quite correctly about the sort of, you know, in outer London, you know, distances can be quite a lot greater. Is there anything else that can be done in terms of incentives for setting up car clubs? Because I think that car clubs can really help with reducing the number of vehicles on the road, and actually people then do that mix and match much, that getting to that sort of 20% only of journeys that are being done in a motorised fashion. Perhaps even, you know, the incentivisation for the car clubs to do more electric vehicles as well to improve air quality. Is there more that can be done there? And just finally, in terms of, you know, we've obviously had the first Med was the one who did the deal over the bicycles that are now the Santander cycles. Any thoughts about having rentable cargo bikes so that people don't necessarily have to have their own and have all the problems with storage, that, you know, that they're available in docking stations, or even, allowed to sort of float free? And I don't like to mention e-scooters and e-motorbikes, but is there going to be any incentives for, better parking so that we move people away from ordinary motorbikes onto e-bikes and e-scooters? You can comment on if you wish. So I'll go back to Christina, and then if anyone else wants to come in on any of those, do join in.
Thanks. Yeah, so the shared mobility point is really important and interesting, as you say. And my team have been working really closely, actually, with car clubs and car club stakeholder groups recently, because we are looking at, like, how much more can we do with this? And I think there has been, it's not a tension, but I think part of the difficulty in kind of getting started in outer London, if you like, is there is higher car ownership for all the reasons you've mentioned. Like, the trips might be longer, they're also more disparate, so it's harder to kind of cater for them all with public transport. Because of that, you have higher car ownership, and where there's higher car ownership, as a kind of commercially viable thing, it's going to be harder for car clubs to get people who need their services. So I think there's a really important case for us working together with car clubs to see how we can help them to be in places which are more helpful in terms of kind of shifting some of those trips that are harder to shift normally. Because if we can get people away from private car ownership into using a car when they need to use one, but not necessarily needing to keep it parked outside the house 80% of the time, that's a really helpful move, I think. So we're working very closely with car clubs on that at the moment. And I think on wider shared mobility as well, and you touched on the bike share schemes and looking at what the future of those are. We've got some electric bikes within that now. As you say, this is a kind of quite a fast moving space. The e-scooter trial will be kind of ongoing monitoring of that in the future.
I kind of lost a tiny bit there about the outcome of the e-scooter trial, which I think we're all keen to hear more about. Obviously, they're quite controversial.
They are, and it probably wasn't you didn't miss a big reveal. I was just saying that we're monitoring the trial and we'll learn from them. But I think that whole kind of shared mobility piece is going to be really important. I think especially if we're talking about more road user charging in outer London, having those kind of appropriate complementary measures, which mean that people are able to make more disparate trips that are less easily catered for by a kind of bus or a tube route, will be really important. So that will be key to our thinking.
I think that's really good, as you've probably gathered. I mean, I think that, no stone or no mode of transport should be left unturned here. I can see that Sarah and Ollie want to come in on this one in that order. Sarah, do you want to say a few things as well?
Sure. Hi. I was just thinking about what your initial question around how do we get more people to switch to those active modes, and I think for me it's a question that is often made more complicated than it needs to be. And I think for me the answer to that question is you make using those active modes, you make walking and cycling easier, and you make driving harder. And thinking about how those two things fall into those sort of different categories. I think you talked about the diversity of people that are on those things, and I think diversity and representation is really important. I think there's a bigger aspect of this than we recognise, of how important it is for folks to see people like them out and about and doing those things, for people to feel like this is something that I could do, and this is something that is possible for me. But I also think that we haven't really done enough in, and I never want to say educating people because it sounds so patronising, but I don't think we've done enough storytelling around how damaging cars can be and how damaging short journeys can be in a city like London. I think a lot of the time when you start conversations with people who are using cars for short journeys about this, they're quite affronted and offended that you're insinuating that there's something wrong with the fact of that journey. And I was thinking about, I think it was Tony earlier who was talking about the metaphor of, idling being the new smoking. And I think, that sort of the way we can associate, at the moment, something, a third of car trips in London are less than 2 kilometres. And the idea of, you wouldn't litter in your local community, and maybe you wouldn't contribute to the damaging of your local environment by taking an unnecessary short journey by car either, and sort of, really helping people understand that it isn't a journey that has no consequences on the community that they live in and the people that are around them, because I think it's something that doesn't enter most folks' minds as it is now. But also, people are going to make those journey changes if it is better for them to do so, if it is faster for them to do so, if it is all of those things. And I think the stories that we tell around what it is like to cycle in a city like London is really important as well. I think most people looking at it from the outside, certainly for me, before I started in lockdown, thought cycling looked absolutely dreadful. All of the stories that I heard about it were often people talking about, close calls that they'd had with cars. It looked dangerous to me. It looked all of that stuff. And it wasn't until I started that I was like, oh, this is actually quite enjoyable. And I think, making sure that we're not putting this out as something that is, the noble thing to be doing or the thing that's good for the environment, not that that's not important, but to say, this is an enjoyable way of getting around. This is an efficient way of getting around. This is a really cheap way of getting around when you compare it to driving in other modes, because people are only going to do it if they think it's going to benefit them to do so. And I think telling that story is there's a little bit of a gap there that we could be working to fill.
Thanks, Sarah. Ollie, I'm going to bring you in next because I can see you've indicated as well.
Yeah, thanks. Just to speak to the point you're making about Outer London with Emma as well. Like, I did some research in my last role that showed that the way we measure public transport accessibility, the public transport accessibility index that TfL helps produce, like in outer London boroughs and inner London boroughs, there's a huge difference. So it's 3 times higher for those in inner London boroughs and outer London. So there's definitely an issue around public transport accessibility in outer London, and that's why a lot of these car journeys are taking place. I agree with you, Leonie, on car clubs. I think, quite frankly, there has been a bit of failure of leadership over the past few years in terms of making car clubs a success in London. It's kind of been kicked under the carpet and at times not really been encouraged at all. But I do believe there are now some constructive discussions being taking place between like London councils, for example, and Transport for London. It's high time, but let's celebrate that that's actually happening. I also, I winced a little bit when you said it's almost like e-scooters are a bit of a dirty word right now, and I don't want this to turn into a micromobility debate, but I do think they're part of the mix, and they're really creating opportunities for a lot of people who aren't necessarily walking and cycling, and it actually helps people get around much easier. So they need to be embraced, but they need to be regulated properly, and I'll leave it at that. Some of the initiatives that are taking place elsewhere, so for example in Italy and Spain, there are like BC bus, there are bike buses that help kids get to school. So like it's all organised, stewarded and everything, but if we could maybe create those sort of initiatives, because we know that 25% of the morning car peak traffic is actually associated with the school run, and actually in boroughs like Tower Hamlets that rises up to almost 42% thanks to some analysis that the Assembly asked for from the Mayor. I was also wondering about the journey to work as well as the big issue in Outer London, how that's going to change. Because prior to the pandemic, 56% of journeys to work were actually made by cars. So again, that's where initiatives like workplace parking levies might come in with incentives for public transport, walking and cycling.
That's interesting that I mentioned e-scooters because I do think it's difficult because a lot of people are still quite angry at how randomly they're used, and also people do speed on them, and they are pretty unregulated at the moment, so it's a bit Wild West out there. But I absolutely agree with you that we do need to bring them into the conversation and start to think about that I don't think they're going to go away, so how do we incorporate them in such a way that they're not dangerous either to pedestrians, and they're also not dangerous to people who then also decide that they're not going to use them on the pavement but go in the road. And I'm really looking forward to hearing what comes out of the trials and how we can best approach that, because I think that is going to be something that we need to think about. And I'm glad to hear that you're, mentioning both the workplace parking levy, which I think is something, Chair, I hope that we can incorporate into perhaps some of our recommendations from our discussions from these two meetings, but also that I also agree that I think car clubs has not really been prioritised sufficiently, and they're a really good way of weaning people away from individual fossil-based car ownership, but giving them, if you like, a security blanket that they've still got for that 20% of those journeys, access to something that will allow them to make them. Christina, I just want to quickly ask you, I think to a certain degree we've covered this, are there plans to update the ULEZ regulations in future years? And I was going to touch on road charging in order to incorporate further changes in the vehicle market as electrification becomes more widespread. And we've kind of touched on, the fact that, vehicle excise duty for a lot of electric vehicles is zero at the moment. Could the ULEZ change in the future?
So we've got a number of kind of policies already thinking about this. So within the MTS, we've already got a commitment to having a central London zero emission zone by 2025. The congestion charge cleaner vehicle discount at the moment, that exempts full electric vehicles, but that will come to an end in 2025, recognising that as the fleet transitions, what we need to do is make sure that we don't end up just replacing our vehicles with electric vehicles, but still continuing to deal with traffic reduction and congestion. And as I said, we're still kind of looking now at that longer term, more sophisticated scheme, which will be able to build in more effectively emissions, not just necessarily emissions from at tailpipe, also thinking about tyre and brake wear, and a more sophisticated use of technology and a more integrated scheme will enable us to do that. So that will be part of our thinking, kind of future-proofing that as we develop it.
Thank you. And I just wanted to ask Elliot, I just want to come back to, we were sort of briefly touching on the Clean Air Fund, which is a national fund. It's only 200 million and it's helping cities elsewhere. Obviously, a lot of the poor air quality nationally is in London. Do you think London should have access to the Clean Air Fund? And do you think it should be enlarged? Because we urgently need to address air quality in London, but of course we urgently need to address, I mean, for anyone who's ever been to Birmingham with its inner ring road and struggled there, it's pretty, a lot of other cities have the same kind of problems as us, maybe not as, they're not as big as London. So the problem is smaller because the city is smaller. But should the Clean Air Fund be enlarged? And is that something that, we should be able to access here in London?
I think absolutely, and I think it's really important to emphasise that it shouldn't be a zero-sum game of like Manchester or Birmingham having to, do a version of the Hunger Games to try and kind of get a very small pot of funding to help them clean up their vehicle fleets. It's absolutely vital that we are providing support nationally, but nationally also includes London. So yes, I would very much support London being able to access the Clean Air Fund on an equitable basis as to other parts of the country, and reflecting the fact, of course, that Londoners do pay into the pot of funding, and also for that to be increased so that, we can accelerate the improvements we need in terms of the vehicle fleet. We can do more to support people to encourage either to zero emission vehicles or even better to walk, cycle and use public transport. And, this is not just a London problem or a city problem. This is a national issue, both in terms of public health, but crucially as well, the government has its own national targets in terms of achieving net zero. And unless we actually help people to make that transition, we're not going to be able to do that in a fair and equitable way. So it's really important that there's additional funding to support that.
Thank you. And just on the issue of transition, finally, if I can start with you and then go to Christina. One of the things that I think was a problem in the summer of 2020 was we had a very short bidding period for funds from Highways England, and then people installed a lot of LTNs, low traffic neighbourhoods, kind of almost overnight in 3 weeks. Whereas with the, we started with the T-charge and then we have the central London ULEZ, and then it's been expanded. And one of the things about taking people on the journey to change their mode change, or just changing their journeys altogether, do you think there's an advantage to starting small and then growing and introducing something on a more gradual basis? Do you think that's a better way to achieve successful behaviour change? I'll start with you, Elliot.
I think there's a combination of things. I think we're lucky in terms of that we do now have a lot of knowledge about how we can actually support behaviour change. And I think I've been really interested to hear everyone's contributions today. It is the combination of stick and carrot. And I think the carrot bit is always the bit that kind of, can be forgotten. So I think it's really important that we now have the evidence about what does work, that we do roll that out in a more consistent way. And one of the crucial mechanisms that you need to support the ability to have carrots, of course, is ongoing funding. And one of the recurring themes, I think, has been around for TfL to do some of this work most effectively, it is going to need a long-term settlement so that we can take a strategic long-term approach with this. And you're right, it can't be feast and famine, Leonie. It needs to be a consistent investment over a number of years because we've got very ambitious targets to meet in London by 2030.
Although I'm conscious that what Simon was saying, I have a sense of urgency about this because like him, I've worked on air quality issues for a number of years. But Christina, I was very struck when the central ULEZ was introduced that I think compliance was about 36% in the month after it had come in, and yet with the expanded ULEZ, compliance was, around about 90%. So do you think that sort of gradual move from smaller to the larger has helped with that, more successful behaviour change?
Yeah, so I think that the gradual versus urgent thing is really interesting because I think that what's been really kind of built over a long time is us kind of collectively, all of us, and I think it goes back to what Sarah was saying about not trying to necessarily teach people. I think we've all been learning as we've gone along, learning about air quality, bringing the public with us and understanding, I think getting that buy-in and understanding of the problem and how it affects us and how our everyday behaviour does that. I think the fact that that's a long and ongoing kind of gradual conversation where people do increase their understanding how their behaviour impacts on it and what kind of changes they can make, I think the kind of having that as a long-running incremental thing is really helpful and helps us kind of move forward. I think the first step then, looking at T-Charge and the implementation of the Central London ULEZ are your first kind of tangible steps. But I think, as you can see, as you say, with the expansion of the ULEZ, that actually, as people's understanding increases, they're much more able to respond to the policy changes. So I think you probably don't need the same very long lead times to introduce further steps because we have been increasing our understanding throughout this period of time. So I think having a kind of a long conversation and a long dialogue is very helpful, but you don't necessarily need to have very long lead times for every step you want to take to try and make improvements.
Okay, well, that's really encouraging to hear that because I do have this big sense of urgency that if we're going to get to where we need to be by 2030, and also the government has introduced changes in terms of vehicles that can be purchased by then, we've got an awful lot to do. I can see that Simon and then Ollie have put their hands up and want to quickly dive in on this one as well, in that order.
Yeah, thanks very much, Leonie, and thank you for all you do on fighting air pollution. A few quick things. I think we need to focus on the big measures, big, high impact, London-wide measures. We clearly need what I would call emergency measures around schools and hospitals and so on, the sort of places that the Mayor has identified are exceeding must be new WHO air quality guidelines. Let's forget about old legal limits and old guidelines. So emergency measures and big high impact measures. I'm not a fan of LTNs. I don't even frankly really quite understand what they are, these traffic neighbourhood things. I would be sort of maybe 51% in favour of them at best. I definitely share Rosamund Deborah's concerns just about how we don't want to be pushing traffic from residential streets into other roads and other places. We need area-wide measures. Similarly, I'm not that keen on low emission bus areas. Frankly, we should be having zero emission buses, not low emission buses. And there's a danger of just focusing on places where legal breaches, estimated by modelling or monitoring, those are the focus for these sort of zones. So we need big, high impact things. The final 2 points I'd make is that I prefer to refer positively to sort of lifestyle changes. Behavioural change sounds a bit like electrodes on the head to me. And let me be very clear what I'm talking about lifestyle changes. I'm not talking about some sort of, hippie sort of lifestyle. What I'm talking about is a spectrum of measures, which when I was advising the UN for 4 years, I described as ranging from bans at one end, charges, campaigns in effect to build public understanding in the middle, incentives, and then adoption, like people, using seatbelts. So lifestyle measures are a package of things which are typically completely omitted from the sort of cost-benefit studies undertaken by governments and even by mayors. The last point I'd make is that I'm not worried about carrying the public with us. I think the public is well ahead of us. The lessons of many of the things which have come in, for example, the government saying it would ban the sale of petrol and diesel vehicles from 2030. I mean, I think the government was expecting pushback from that, but as soon as they announced it, they had virtually no pushback. The WHO brought in these new, highly researched air quality guidelines. People just got that, and then that just sets a new reality. So I think what we really need here is an urgency which accepts that in a street near you, Putney High Street, we're talking about average levels of pollution 6 times the new World Health Organization air quality guideline. This is just not acceptable. And all this talk about 2030 may be fine for sort of generals sitting behind the front lines in a chateau in the First World War. But actually, the trenches, we need to crack this problem, this pollution problem, in the next 2 or 3 years. We cannot wait 8 years, 10 years longer. Thank you.
Thanks, Simon. I'm very aware of the situation in Putney High Street, much improved, but still, filthy air there, Brixton Road and Oxford Street being the top 3 for so many years. Ollie?
Yeah, I'll be really quick, because I appreciate we've been going on for a while. Just to pick up what Christina said, if you don't mind me asking, because you mentioned zero emission zone in 2025, and we're talking about bringing people with us, timescales and all that sort of stuff. I feel like maybe this panel are the only people that know the plan is for a zero emission zone in 2025, and is that actually going to be happening then? Because I'm a bit worried we're also taking our eye off the ball with regards to central London. We're seeing the congestion charge hours reduce. We've seen City of London take away their zero emission street, and nitrogen dioxide, quite frankly, increasing on that street as a result of it. And we're seeing all the streets in Soho. It was glorious, during lockdown, and we helped businesses, and then suddenly all the cars are back. So whilst we're talking about what we're doing next in outer London, I'm also worried we're taking our eye off the ball in central London, where we're still getting illegal pollution. I think we probably need to stop you from questioning Christina, but I think that might be a point that we want to pick up, Chair, about, do we have a recommendation about improving the advertising of the fact that this change is going to come in 2025. But thank you. I think that's probably the end of my questions on that section.
Thank you very much. Just on that, we have 4 sections remaining, and that's fine, because I think the sections we've done were the big kind of chunky bits, and they're really important. But I'm going to limit us with these sections to 12 minutes a section to make sure we get through them. Just before I do that, though, on the kind of final point that Ollie just made and the wider point, Christina and Elliot, could I ask for a commitment from you both for written submissions, based essentially on what our understanding or your understanding is of the Mayor of the GLA's powers to reduce road emissions and what the limits are in doing that? And would you both be happy to write to a committee with a short submission? I can see Elliot nodding. I see Christina nodding. Fantastic. Thank you very much. So moving on to the next section, I'm going to turn to Sarah. Specifically want to talk about low traffic neighbourhoods and school streets, which has obviously been in the whole conversation already, but just to zoom in on them. So I think the first thing I want to ask you about is there any evidence that actually they haven't been reducing air pollution, and in fact, they've just been dispersing this? Because we often hear this, and I just wanted to ask you about the evidence.
Yeah, for sure. So a lot of the evidence that's come in from the low traffic neighbourhood trials that have happened as part of the COVID emergency over the sort of couple of years that they've been in place, obviously the ones that have been in Lambeth have been in quite some time. There are some that have been in for a lot less time. There isn't evidence that's coming in that it is increasing pollution. There is evidence that it's coming in that it's decreasing pollution unequally, I would say. So, you're much more likely to get, if we looked at Railton low traffic neighbourhood, for instance, which is the one that I'm most familiar with, you're seeing a really large decrease in car use in certain sort of streets inside of that. So, motor vehicle traffic fell by 63% inside the LTN and 18% when you include the boundary roads. Obviously, the sort of changes in air pollution, there's going to be a much drastic change in terms of what's inside the LTN versus what's on those boundary roads. I think the thing to factor in with LTNs is they've kind of become a sort of like vision for a lot of people as like, is this the solution? And I think the answer to that is no. But I think it's also they're part of the solution. And I think, you'll hear a lot of people that say, well, LTNs don't do anything to reduce air pollution and congestion and traffic on main roads. And I think there's conversations that you can have around levels of congestion and the number of people are driving and all of those sorts of things and changes over time. But I think it's also, you can't expect one solution to fit with everything. And I think that's why it's so important that it's included in a sort of package of interventions that include things like ULEZ, that include things like better segregated cycle infrastructure. For instance, there's a road within the Railton LTN where they've seen an increase in cycling of 92% and a decrease in 3,000 cars per day, which is, a huge change. But if those cyclists have nowhere safe to go on from there, the potential impact of that is going to be very reduced. So I think in terms of LTNs do a really good job in terms of incentivizing people to try other modes of travel, to build their confidence. It's amazing for safety. We know that a lot of the residential roads are what are casually termed rat runs, where people go through, were never designed, were never built to hold the number of traffic that they're holding, and they're much more dangerous for pedestrians and different things like that. And they play a great role there. I think they're part of the solution when it comes to air pollution, but definitely not in isolation and definitely not as a sort of single intervention.
Thank you. And at our last committee meeting, we heard strong concerns from Rosamond Kissy-Deverett, particularly around the social justice of it and making sure they're equitable. What more can be done to make sure that if they're introduced equitably?
I think it's a really good question, and I really value what she's bringing to the debate, and I really value as well. I hear her speak so often about the South Circular, and her points on that are like very true. Like the LTNs in this area are doing nothing to help traffic on the South Circular, but also I don't think they're very much designed to. They're designed to look at a different thing, and I think we can often sort of tar one solution with a brush that's got to solve everything when really it's looking at that isolated thing. But in terms of how we make sure that they, don't disproportionately affect some groups rather than others, I'd really encourage people on the committee to read the new report that's just been done from Possible and Transport for All on thinking about equalities and thinking about how these transport decisions affect people. I think it's really important to think about to keep in focus of this, of who drives and who it is that bears the brunt of sort of car dominance in London in the first place. If you are driving, you're much more likely to be wealthier. The more your income goes up, I think up to £75,000 a year, so does the likelihood that you're someone who drives, and sort of different aspects of who is actually getting impacted by these things. But for me, I think one of the ways when you look at housing and the way that people live in London is when you look at council estates. And the majority of council estates in London are actually mini LTNs in themselves. You can't use them as cut-throughs to get from one place to another. I think thinking about how we expand those out so that it is broader neighbourhoods around those council estates where, again, there's going to be less traffic, there's going to be less people going through there, is a really helpful way of making sure that we're sort of expanding the benefits for people who are more vulnerable and for people who, might be more impacted by the air pollution on these roads. But I think, equality, making sure that equality impact assessments are done at the beginning of these processes, and being really fastidious about that. And things like, Transport for All is an incredible organisation, and I know that they will come to any council and give you sort of advice and feedback on how it is that the interventions that you're proposing are likely to impact upon different communities. For example, Lambeth here in Lambeth, they just trialled some colourful crossings, and they had Transport for All come in and audit those, and found that it was, absolutely hellish for someone with a visual impairment to navigate. And so those things were lost. So making sure that you are getting feedback from those kinds of organisations, making sure that they come in, is a really good way of making sure that they, don't negatively impact people that we're trying to help.
Thank you, Sarah. And then my brief last question to you is, at the beginning of this meeting, which was a long time ago, Dr. Mudway spoke about protecting the health of children in particular. What benefit has school streets brought to protect the health of children, in your opinion? Yeah,
for sure. Do you want me to answer that one?
Yeah, sorry, that was to Sarah. Sorry, and I was just referencing your earlier evidence.
Great. I think there were 2 points that have sort of been made during this conversation, and again, a long time ago in these conversations, so we'll have to stretch our minds back. But around the fact that a lot of congestion happens on the school run, and a lot of parents, when you speak to them about the fact that they do drive their kids to school, the reason that they do that is because it doesn't feel safe to walk or cycle with their kids to school with the amount of traffic on the road. Again, a self-fulfilling sort of circle there, where you don't feel safe, so you use the car, and then more people don't feel safe, so they use the car, and then there's more cars, so you don't feel safe. But also the fact that that air pollution, you're not protected from it by being inside a car. That is something that is, you're still breathing that in. For school streets, I think one of the key benefits that they've had for health is, again, we've talked about making it harder for people to drive. When you close the streets that schools are on during the hours of drop off and pick up, it means that parents can be confident that they know that there are going to be less cars on the road that are heading to their school. It's going to be less of a nightmare trying to find a parking spot and all of those different things. And they have that sort of safety in being able to go there. I've been really blown away by how popular school streets are across the country, not just in London. It feels like, in terms of the fact that people feel like they're healthier and it's an easier way to get to school, but also it just being a much more pleasant way to spend time with your kids in the morning, rather than, sort of sitting in traffic, but actually going for a walk or going for a ride with them. And if sort of members of the committee haven't been around a school street, I'd really encourage them to go and pay a visit one morning and sort of see what it looks like, because it can be quite a transformation. And it is a really sort of popular way of introducing those, and in some cases really low cost. A lot of the school streets I've seen have parent volunteers who sort of stand at the edges of the streets with some signs and some pie beers and explain to people what's going on, and sort of really manage it themselves and get involved. So it can be a really sort of positive, again, part of the puzzle in helping people think about different ways that they can get around their neighbourhoods.
Thank you, Sarah. And a supplementary from Assemblymember Cooper.
Thank you, Chair. It was just, and I completely agree with Sarah. Actually, it's quite inspiring to go to school streets, and it's also really interesting to see informal anti-idling campaigns being conducted by parents against other parents who've turned up and are trying to drop off their children out of an idling car. So that's been a spin-off result. But the question I really wanted to ask was to Elliot, and it might be something, given that we are relatively short of time, that you can write to us about. But there's been a lot of money that has gone into the network of school streets. How are we monitoring to make sure that the schools in the most need, that have got the dirtiest air quality, if you like, have been targeted for the school streets and potentially for other measures? Because I think it's something that Simon and Ollie and various people have referred to today. Once you've stunted a child's lungs, you can't make them grow back. So it's really important that we are installing, given that budgets are limited, the school streets in the places where it's going to be absolutely critical to have that benefit.
So, yeah, I think, as I might have mentioned last time, there's been some fantastic results from the school street. So 23% reduction in NO2 at pick-up and drop-off times. Clearly, they are a crucial tool in the arsenal that we have in terms of improving air quality. I think there was an action that I took last time, and I've been working with TfL to write back to you about whether there will be a list of these school streets and other infrastructure. So as part of that, I can add something around the way that they're being evaluated in terms of location. I think it is also perhaps worth bearing in mind, just very quickly, just in terms of the other work we did in terms of our school audits programme. Obviously, because so many of the schools which were being audited were such a high proportion of the schools which are located in areas with illegal levels of air pollution were unfortunately those schools with very, very high levels of children who were classified as deprived based on receiving free school meals. Generally, where you take action has a disproportionate benefit for some of those more disadvantaged people. But I'll write in more detail about that.
Thank you very much. Really appreciate that, because I think it's really important that we know that the things that are being implemented are definitely getting to the most important areas and addressing the problem. Although I do agree with Simon that, you know, in some ways targeting measures is not as good as the bigger, wider measures. Thank you, Chair.
Assembly Member Sheikh, thank you.
Thanks, Chair. I'm having a bit of issues with my internet, so I might do video off in the hope that the sound comes through okay. Is that coming through okay?
Yeah, we can hear you loud and clear.
Fab. Okay, well, Elliot, you've touched upon this at the beginning of the meeting, so it's good to kind of circle back round to it. But we wanted to talk a bit about the decarbonisation initiatives that have had sort of the greatest impacts on reducing emissions and protecting public health, and particularly on the electric buses. And the charging infrastructure operation that we're aspiring to for 2025. So could you just talk to us a little bit more about that, please?
So obviously I talked about earlier about the huge progress that we've made in terms of the bus fleet, in terms of reducing its emissions. That was linked into the programme of retrofits, but also introducing new buses and then targeting those on the low emission bus zones. The great news is, of course, with the low emission zone introducing a London-wide Euro 6 standard, all buses meet those, not just the ones in the low emission bus zones. But we want to go beyond that. We want to have a zero emission bus fleet. The Mayor has kind of set out that is working closely with TfL. That is possible by 2030. Clearly, that is dependent on having the right levels of government support. But we have been making huge progress in terms of electrification already, with around 650 zero-emission buses already on the streets. And one of the key things that we've been doing is actually looking at how we can support the charging infrastructure that you actually need at the 70-odd bus garages that we have, to make sure that we can support as quick an acceleration of of electric buses as possible. And also, where possible, do some really interesting, innovative things about, if we're doing grid upgrades for a bus garage, which of course, electric buses use a huge amount of energy, how can we also do that in a way that actually supports other local needs, whether that's on-street EV charging or whether that's specific EV charging for specialist fleets, like, for example, commercial fleets. So there's a really huge opportunity. I know I've mentioned this a couple of times before, but the challenge that we face at the moment is that we don't have a long-term settlement with government. And without that, we can't make the long-term investments that we need to actually ensure that we have the right infrastructure in place to support that electrification of the bus fleet. So everything really depends on so much of what we've discussed today around getting that long-term settlement.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more on that, Elliot. I think, it's just good governance, isn't it? In order to be able to plan for the future, you just need to be able to have a secure funding deal, so you can kind of set out the strategy and know you'll be able to deliver it. Thank you for that. I mean, could you also just drill in a little bit more on to what extent do the sort of low emission bus zones reduce the toxicity of London's air?
So I think the low emission bus zones were a really interesting policy. They were about targeting new buses or retrofitted buses as they were entering the fleet on some of the locations outside of central London, which had the highest proportional contribution in terms of air pollution from buses and were really, really polluted. And they only spoke earlier about Brixton Road and about Putney High Street. And for years, part of my job, I wasn't really allowed much for holiday over Christmas, because I knew about the 2nd or 3rd of January, we would be managing the fact that we would already be exceeding in some place one of those locations in terms of the number of hours that you're allowed in terms of exceedances before you legally breached. And what we've seen through the low emission bus zones, and I'm happy to write with you with the report that we produced, which is quite comprehensive and looks at each of the bus zones in detail, but just to pull out 2 of them. So in Putney High Street, in terms of the annual average, we saw something around a 40% reduction in the NO2 concentrations. But in terms of those hourly exceedances, so some of the very, very worst peaks in air pollution, I mean, we're talking around the 99% level reduction. I mean, it's absolutely incredible. And similarly at Brixton, we saw around a 50% reduction in annual averages. And I think, you know, near 100% reduction in the hourly exceedances, which is part of the reason why I think it's so interesting and such a powerful example about what we've been able to do with the bus fleet in terms of reducing emissions. And that's why I think the opportunity to have the electrification is so important as well.
That's brilliant. Thank you, Elliot. Simon, I was wondering if you would be up for coming in on either of those questions. So both discussing sort of the low emission bus zones and their kind of reduction of toxicity in London's air, but also, yeah, sort of the aspiration for 2025 with the all electric buses and the infrastructure to come with it.
I've not really got anything to add to what Elliot said in the interest of time. Thank you. Thank you very much for the opportunity. I have got some things I would like to say before the end, if the chair would allow me, but on different subjects. Thank you.
Cool, thank you. I'm sure Zach's noted that. I'll move on to another. Oh, Ollie, your hand's up. Do you want to come in? And then I've got another question, a couple of questions. Go for it.
Just on buses. I think like the rollout of electric buses, I've talked previously about like, Elliot's absolutely right, like low emission bus zones have been fantastic intervention. I just wonder if we could have some like zero emission bus zones. If we're thinking about, we've got 950 zero emission buses now, we're going to 9,000. How do we roll out the electric buses where they are most needed from an air pollution perspective? I can write to these with some research we did previously that looked at actually bus emissions and bus pollution is far higher in the most deprived parts of the city. So if we can actually roll out the cleanest buses and the electric buses in those areas, that'd be great.
Oh, we'd be very happy to have you write with that information, Ollie. Thank you very much. And I guess sort of the last part I wanted to kind of, the last couple of bits, which is how effective has the synergy between active travel, low traffic neighbourhoods and low emission bus zones initiatives been in improving air quality in London? Because obviously we've talked quite a lot about those three aspects throughout this meeting. We've also talked about the need to have sort of joint up strategic thinking about how all of them work in synergy. So just kind of wanted to tease out drawing that all together. So I'll put that open to anyone on the panel who wants to answer, just indicate with hand or unmuting. Yeah, go for it, Elliot.
I'm conscious of time, so I'll be very quick and I won't repeat, you know, the impact that, you know, Christina set out at the beginning of this meeting. But I think, as I explained in terms of our strategies, what we've done is quite interesting and really important is we've taken an integrated approach. So we have thought about our environment strategy and the way it works with the transport strategy. We then do think about the land use planning through the London plan. And I think things like healthy streets, which do actually bring together so many of these different concepts, have been a really powerful way of understanding and explaining and implementing these improvements, which then have resulted in those really important health impacts that we've seen and those benefits for Londoners.
Fantastic, thank you, Elliot. I don't know if anyone else wanted to come in. Love a panel that enjoys brevity. Christina, you've unmuted. I don't know if that was you coming in or not.
I can do, if it's helpful.
Yeah,
I can keep quiet if you want to move on.
No, I think it'd be great to hear from you.
So I was just going to say, like, as sort of it repeats a bit, but I think the real cornerstone of the Mayor's transport strategy is the mode shift and this target of 80% of journeys being made by sustainable modes. And I know I say it a lot, but this is where all of it comes together, and this is the point of the strategic, holistic, joined-up planning, because actually, if we can achieve that 80% mode share target, the best way that we can reduce emissions is by actually removing cars from the road and taking away all of those emissions, tailpipe, tyre and brake wear, and moving to more sustainable modes. So all of these policies working together is the kind of point of having the strategic planning function and what we're trying to achieve with the MTS. And that 80% target, that figure in there, which kind of looks quite like a transport figure, but it, you know, this is how we achieve emissions reductions. It helpfully kind of does that across the piece.
That's really helpful, thank you. I mean, Christina, if it's right, if I could follow up with a couple of other points, I mean, a couple of other targets. So obviously, the Mayor's commitment that 10% of London's bus network will be zero emission by the end of 2022, which is coming up quite soon into the horizon, but also sort of 100% zero emission bus fleet by 2034. How confident are you that these targets can be met? And I think it's, you know, fair and important to put this in the context of what Elliot's been saying in terms of the TfL funding deal and the lack of security about the kind of future when it comes to these targets.
Yeah, so with a fleet of 9,000 odd vehicles, we are aiming to have 800 zero emission vehicles by the end of March. So we are moving forward with that quite quickly, and that's already a kind of more mature and expanding market now than it was. And I think if we had adequate funding, we could be quite confident that we could deliver a fully zero emission bus network by 2034. I think 2030 is still conceivable, but the opportunity for that is kind of slipping away if we don't get the funding needed to actually get that to happen. That is obviously going to become more difficult. So I think we can do it. It is possible. We set out how we could do it, but without the funding, I don't think we can be confident that we can hit it.
Brilliant. Well, yeah, I can see why that would be the situation. Elliot, I don't know if you wanted to come in and add anything to that. Yeah, I thought you've covered it already. Thank you very much. And Chair, I'll pass back over to you.
Thank you. Assembly Member Best.
Thanks. Sorry, yeah, just moving on to questions around non-road mobile machinery. And for Ian and Elliot to start us off on this section, did you want to expand on what we know about the dangers of pollution from machinery at construction sites? I'll go towards Ian first because I can see you.
So I don't really work in this particular area, but the people in my team do. But clearly it's not just diesel emissions from diesel operated vehicles, but there are also fugitive dust emissions from groundworks, for example. And I suppose increasingly, and I don't know if this is something we were going to touch on, as we have a move to developing brownfield sites within London, the extent to which we should be concerned about the remediation mechanisms for land which is being used for housing or other purposes, which is formerly heavily contaminated, where I think perhaps a discussion is worth being had.
Yeah, absolutely agreed. Elliot?
Yeah, so I think I might mention this earlier. I wonder whether non-road mobile machinery might be another buses, in the sense of that there's a relatively, although Ian's right in terms of that it's not just about the machinery used on site, it's also the demolition or other construction activity as well. But in terms of the machinery used on site, the stage standards which are used to regulate their emissions are kind of further behind where we are in terms of other road vehicles. So it's a relatively small number of bits of plants. They're very, very polluting. And there might be quite a big opportunity in terms of us focusing on how we can continue to reduce those emissions. And of course, the impacts are highly localized. They're around, generally speaking anyway, around a construction site. And I just think we've made some good progress in terms of the non-road mobile machinery low emission zone using the Mayor's planning powers, but it's not a low emission zone in the sense of that the ultra low emission zone is, and we just don't have the flexibility in terms of polluters being able to charge to use a certain bit of equipment. We have to give exemptions instead to let them use a non-compliant bit of kit. So I think that there's ways that we can continue to improve the way that we actually tackle non-road mobile machinery. It's quite an acronym, and build on the success that we've had so far. But I think to do that in the most effective way, we are going to need additional powers. But if it's helpful, I can talk a little bit more about some of the work that we've been doing to tackle it in the meantime.
I think so, but I think it would also be really helpful if you could just spell out the additional powers needed for you to do more as well.
So we've been in discussions with DEFRA about it, and interestingly, I think this is one area where DEFRA they're really interested to kind of work out how they can use secondary legislation. So the State for Environment already has quite extensive powers where he can or she can put in place additional regulatory tools for the Mayor to use. One of them that we, as I said, the best model that we've kind of developed in London, which has been hugely effective, is similar to the ultra low emission zone model. Under the GLA Act, non-road mobile machinery is explicitly excluded from the powers that the Mayor has in terms of those kind of road user charging schemes. And what we think is the most simple change is just let us use the same powers around non-road mobile machinery, and then we'd be able to bring about significant improvements from the remaining non-compliant equipment which is used on some of those sites.
Thanks, Elliot. I suppose same with you as well. How important is it for neighbourhoods to address air pollution coming from nearby construction sites?
So there's a couple of things which I think are very important as part of this. So obviously, as part of planning permission, rules are put in place around not just the plant that's used on the site, but also around the kind of the standards and approaches which are used for everything from kind of demolition to the way that vehicles transport spoil off site, which can actually then kind of result in small particles being left behind and trundling along as the vehicle goes along. So it's really important that we have the right standards in place as part of the planning process. It's then really important to make sure that those sites are being properly inspected. So there's a whole range of tools which helps with that, everything from the voluntary considerate constructor scheme, but also in terms of borough-led enforcement. And one of the ways, particularly with the standards of the plant that's used on sites to make sure it does meet the non-road mobile machinery low emission zone standards, is that we've actually funded the boroughs to actually, and then they've also match funded the funding to actually support enforcement officers who can go around the site and actually do inspections of the equipment. And this has proved to be really effective. I think it's something like when people inspect, there's something like a 57% compliance rate in terms of the non-road mobile machinery low emission zone standards. But after the intervention of the inspectors and the kind of remedial actions being put in place, that then increases to the kind of the 80-90% level. So it really demonstrates the importance of inspections and the importance of local authorities working with the sites to make sure that the best standards are applied.
That's a good improvement, but that's still really a really low starting point, isn't it? Is there much stick in enforcement, or is it mainly carrot?
So, well, I think this goes back to the powers point. So the only real kind of ultimate sanction that a local authority who's got the planning permission in place can use is basically to stop all the works on the site, which can, in some circumstances, be disproportionate. This is why the same kind of ultra low emission zone approach of whether, if you're not using a non-compliant bit of plant, you've got the polluters pay principle of actually you're paying to use the non-compliant kit, and if you're actually breaching the standards, then there's a penalty that you pay instead, is a much more effective way of actually helping to boost compliance.
And you touched on monitoring there. So what provisions are in place to ensure effective monitoring, or how do local authorities ensure they're monitoring effectively?
So I think the key thing that we have in terms of the plant that's used on site is around, as I say, the inspections that actually take place. But one of the critical things that we ask the sites to actually do is to register their equipment, and there is a website where they can do that. And then you can also, that's how we get the data to actually track what kind of equipment's being used on different sites. And of course, the inspections are important then to kind of verify that the information that's being put in through the website is actually accurate. So there is a mechanism in place and for kind of the sites to actually report the equipment that they're using and for them that to be inspected. There are also provisions through the London Plan and the supplementary planning guidance linked into that, which depending on the site and the circumstances, you can have a whole range of different things like on-site monitoring as well to make sure that you're not getting, very high peaks in terms of pollution on site as a result of certain type of activity.
Can I just add something here, because you asked about health. I would say there's a dearth, if not a complete absence, of studies which have looked on the impact of large-scale building activities on what we may define as being bystander populations as opposed to occupational exposures within the site, and that's a weakness. And I flagged up the potential development of brownfield sites. I think it's incredibly important. The government has just released a huge amount of money to allow development on brownfield sites within London. And then we begin to move beyond, I think, what we would regard as being the standard criterion pollutants. We begin to move away from NO2 and PM2.5 to other potential contaminants, which are historic legacy contaminants on that land. And there, I am incredibly concerned that the money which is going into brownfield site redevelopment is coming with a commitment to cut red tape. And I'm not certain to what extent that cutting of red tape actually will deal with remediation and monitoring on those sites.
Thanks, Ian. Just to come back to you, Elliot, when it comes to GLA-related construction sites, TfL, and perhaps Christina, if you wanted to come with TfL, what are we doing to lead the way to show that we are doing this ourselves?
So there's a couple of things that we do. So a lot of the procurement that's done across for both the GLA and TfL is done via TfL procurement. So as part of the Responsible Procurement Code, one of the requirements is that people should ask for non-road mobile machinery low emission zone compliance, again, quite a mouthful, within their contracts. However, it's worth bearing in mind that for things like events, because of the way that the powers that we use for the planning system can only really be applied through construction, through planning permission for construction sites, we actually miss out on things like events. And so what we've been doing is been working with groups like the events team to try and capture their level of compliance and try and support them in using compliant kits. In terms of things like roadworks as well, we're putting in place a database that will be used by the GLA group in terms of actually reporting on their own activities so that we can better capture the overall level of compliance. And then even where it's not a formal requirement, we can actually continue to make sure that we're leading by example.
Perhaps I can comment as well, Emma, if I may.
Sure.
It's Simon. Just a few quick points on non-road mobile machinery. For those who aren't familiar with it, who might be listening, we're talking about yellow construction plant. This is a very important equipment and very polluting equipment. There are solutions out there. JCB produces a fantastic e-tech range. All electric yellow plant for many construction needs, and they're looking at hydrogen, and we'll be introducing hydrogen for the more power demanding bits of kit. I think it's also worth highlighting that the GLA's consultation on air quality neutral and air quality positive closes on this Sunday. It's been a long consultation, but it closes this weekend. And we need a really bold shift there. And I don't think we're there at the moment with the proposals. A bold shift there. These are the planning requirements for air quality neutral, air quality positive. We have historically had a position where more polluting sources have been allowed to emit more pollution than less polluting sources, which is clearly not technology neutral. I really do hope that Elliot brings in some big changes as a result of this consultation, which Cleaner in London will obviously be responding to. To answer Emma's point about powers, the City of London proposed an emissions reduction bill, and we tried to get changes made to the Environment Bill, but Cleaner in London has also proposed a new Clean Air Act, which would give local authorities the powers they need to require zero and ultra low emissions from yellow plant, from stationary machinery that Elliot's mentioned, but also from buildings. And the last point I'd like to make before hopefully being allowed to make a very final point before the whole session closes about urgency is I'd like to perhaps pose a question to Elliot as to whether perhaps he would be willing to produce some new maps. We've seen these very powerful maps over many years of London showing nitrogen dioxide or PM2.5. But based on legal limits, which are obviously hugely out of date. So I'd really like to see, before PERDA starts, so in the next month, I'd really like to see maps which show nitrogen dioxide with the legend or the calibration relative to the new WHO air quality guideline, also the new WHO particle guideline, and ideally, it may not be possible in that time, but certainly London-wide in that time. But ideally what I'd like to do is see for all the air quality focus areas a similar picture, because it really does show people what the problems are locally from particles of nitrogen dioxide. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Simon. We do strictly still have a final section left as well. I'm not really meant to let guests interview or ask guests other questions, but I did see Elliot nodding or indicating. I don't know if Elliot, you want to comment.
So I'm happy to look into it, but just to clarify that there's all kind of rules the statistics code apply in terms of like consistency and comparability of the map. So I'm happy to take it away, but I'll need to check before I can commit to that. But happy to look at it. Thank you. Back to you, Assembly Member Best.
Thanks. I just wanted to ask Christina if you wanted to say anything on what TfL are doing.
Yeah, so in terms of that kind of leading the way, we're committed to ensuring that all our new contracts will require freight and servicing vehicles under 3.5 tonnes travelling to TfL buildings to be zero emission. And we'll also be complying with the non-road mobile machinery low emission zone standards on our developments and on all of the NRMM procured by us or used by suppliers or contractors. That will be zero emission by 2040. And we're also following the London Plan guidance on reducing dust PM10 and 2.5 from construction activities. I think just in terms of like how we're kind of supporting other people as well. So the London Plan is clear that development proposals should demonstrate all reasonable endeavours have been taken towards the use of non-road mobile machinery. And through our construction logistic plans and delivery and servicing plans, we provide kind of freight tools and websites to support other people to do that as well.
Thanks, Christine. Just one question to ask you, because of the type of construction work TfL does, obviously you've got the big major projects where it's quite, I say easy, but it's easier to get good environmental strategies and investment with new high-tech kit. But there's a lot of smaller projects across London where TfL will use smaller contractors or big contractors who are sending out, perhaps their older kit. How do you kind of tie, because those big major projects, it's quite easy to focus in on them and make sure they're compliant and working to the high standards. How about those smaller projects happening and quite often closer to people's homes?
Yeah, so our contractual requirements are for all projects. So regardless of size, that they need to meet those standards set out in the NRMM low emission zone standards. So that's irrespective of size.
Okay, great. Thanks. And I think, sorry, and just finally, Elliot, I think you touched on this throughout, but if there was anything final on greater powers that would help the Mayor on this.
I think the only other things that I think are perhaps worth thinking about, and Simon touched on this earlier, is that some cities, and I think particularly about the American cities, have really strong powers in terms of setting legal requirements for retrofit on their buildings and energy efficiency standards. And that's been quite a powerful tool, both from a carbon perspective, but also particularly in places like New York, which still has a lot of kind of oil boilers, which are causing huge problems over there from a PM perspective to actually reduce those emissions. And I think that the other challenge that we've faced as well is, and I think it's improved, and I think the Port of London Authority has shown real leadership on this in recent years, but again, making sure that we have the right regulatory framework for the river. Potentially emissions as a proportion are going to continue to increase as we get better at reducing emissions from road transport. And if we want the river to be used more and more for the movement of goods and waste and other various bits and pieces, we just need to make sure that we're addressing emissions from the river. And there's currently a whole variety of different agencies and boroughs and other people who are involved in regulating vessels on the river. So I think that's potentially another area to look at, as well as the other things I said earlier.
So just really quickly, and this is really briefly to you, Elliot, I just wanted to get your thoughts on the decentralisation of red diesel through the new tax, and whether you think that's going to have a big impact in April or perhaps a slower, steady decrease in the use of red diesel, and what that will mean for London.
So it's something that we fed into, and clearly, we want to make sure that there is, and I think Simon touched on this really well, the incentives in place for non-road mobile machinery to also switch to ultra low and zero emission technologies, which are starting to develop. So we think it's important, but I think that in practice, the change will probably be a gradual one rather than like an immediate dramatic change.
Thank you very much. I'm going to move us on there just because we've still got one section left in 8 minutes. Assembly Member Cooper, I know you indicated you had a brief intervention. It's just to check if you still want to do that.
Yes, thank you, Chair. And it was it's something that I'd be very happy for Elliot or Christina to communicate on afterwards, if that helps in terms of time. But it was really, we often talk about the different sources of air pollution, and we know that there's concentrations in certain geographical areas. Last month, we were asking, what percentage of London's air pollution comes from incinerators, and that was a very hard question to answer because they've got tall chimneys and it's all dispersed around the place. And I wondered if we have any knowledge at all about what percentage of London's air pollution comes from the non-road mobile machinery, because I know that, for example, on Sunday evenings, the percentage that's due to wood-burning stoves goes up. And I just wondered if we had any kind of concept, because I know London has been full of a lot of building sites and there's been a huge amount of construction going on. If you're able to supply that, that would be great. It may be, I don't know what the percentage is. So thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. I do really want to hear the answer because it's fascinating, but you're right, we need to move on. So finally, for the final section, Ollie, I saw you had your hand up earlier. I've got some questions aimed at you, but if you want to bring in some of your answer earlier too, then please do. This is specifically around freight and deliveries. So the first question really is, what should the Mayor be doing to reduce the impact on air pollution from freight and deliveries?
Yeah, I'll just briefly on the NRMM, just to make a point that the previous mayor as well was asking for powers. I think this has been going on for about 10 years from DEFRA, so I'd be interested to see if the Prime Minister wants to respond in the same way he was asking at that time. On the bans and on freight, I think Ultra Low Emission Zone is an absolute, golden child in terms of reducing emissions from freight. But we are seeing that 1 in 4 vans, I think, at the minute are still, or certainly journeys made by vans, are not compliant with that scheme. So there's much more that needs to be done. And I'm especially concerned that I think we've seen, looking at my notes, 50% more miles being driven by vans on minor roads in urban areas in the past 10 years. So there's a massive influx of diesel vans in our cities. There are now 4.1 million vans registered in the UK, and that's increased from about 2.5 million, I think, 20 years ago. So this is an issue that needs to be tackled, and I don't think the ultra low emission zone is necessarily going to do that, because we know it doesn't necessarily reduce the vehicle kilometres. It might help increase the cleaner vehicles. What can the mayor do about this? Well, quite often it always starts with awareness raising, but I think there's probably something to be said around helping to nudge consumers to understand the implications that their sort of online purchases have. And I know during the pandemic, online deliveries have been really important for people, but I think there is something to be said about the impact the next day delivery has if you're buying a t-shirt rather than buying the 5 t-shirts at the end of the month. You can actually consolidate your deliveries a lot more, and maybe there's something to be said about working with the boroughs and industry to start to have consolidation centres for deliveries, for example, where you walk to your local shop. And I know these things are happening, but it's all a bit mixed at the minute, and maybe we need a little bit more nudge. So, for example, if there's any possibility of bringing in some sort of, in the same way we did with plastic bags, 10p on a plastic bag, if we can put an extra 10, 20p on the next day delivery in certain parts of the capital, maybe that will start to nudge people's behaviour. And the other, we've touched on cargo bikes as well. I think there's a lot of potential there to move it away from coming across as like a niche answer. Elliot talked earlier about moving beer kegs, but also the cocktail, right? The cocktail is kind of like the niche thing we think of, but actually moving beer kegs and helping pubs get their deliveries, this can actually happen on those bikes. And I think cargo bikes, it helps to legitimise some of the cycling infrastructure that's going in as well, because there's been debates about putting in big bike lanes on some of the major roads. Park Lane was an example Simon brought up earlier. We've talked about Euston Road before, but actually they could turn into cycle freight lanes as well, because there's a lot of potential for that. So I'd love to see more endorsement, grants going out to businesses to help switch over to cargo bikes as well.
And you've answered most of my questions there. You've interviewed yourself. Fantastic. Very concise. But can I just check if there's any future plans for our capital's waterways? And if there's any plans there.
I'll probably hand that to Elliot.
So in terms of, just to clarify, in terms of using waterways for freight, specifically, you mean?
Exactly.
This is something I kind of touched on earlier in terms of, I think we do want to use the waterways more effectively in terms of moving freight around. In terms of things like the London Plan that sets that out, there's some really good practice that's kind of emerged through things like the Thames Tideway Tunnel, and potentially also, dare I mention it again, Silvertown as well, in terms of moving some of the spoil from those sites. And I think, but in order for us to do that, we do need to make sure that we have the right standards in place. We've seen these dramatic improvements in terms of HGV emissions, so we need to make sure that we're making the same progress in terms of river vessels as well. But yes, in terms of the overall plan, we have this huge asset in terms of the river, which we should be using more effectively.
Thank you, Elliot. It's dangerous to check in Silvertown 3 minutes before the end of the meeting. I'll move on from there. Ollie, just finally, you mentioned there commercial distribution, or sorry, consolidated commercial delivery areas, and you talked about nudging. What opportunities are there for local councils or national government to get these going?
Yeah, I think about the example that the City of London's done. You know, they've teamed up with a certain distribution company to actually lease out some of their redundant car parking facility so that it can be used for more better sustainable means, which is freight consolidation rather than car parking. So I wonder if there's some potential for boroughs to start applying that model elsewhere. And one other thing I meant to mention as well, like picking up that discussion we had on zero emission zone earlier, we mustn't underestimate like the effect that setting this notice period, having this plan in advance about how standards are going to be changing has on the business, the decisions that businesses make, right? When I used to work in public policy, behind the scenes, the fleet managers would say to me, oh, you know, it really is the city regulation that helps us shift our fleets along and helps us change what we're doing. So I wouldn't underestimate, you know, the mayor setting out a plan for zero emission zones and things like that would make a massive impact.
Thank you, Ollie. Simon, I can see you've got your hand up and we're rapidly approaching 1 o'clock. I did promise you'd also have an opportunity to make any final comments too. So if I can just encourage you to be succinct, but the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I'd really just like to say that I think this has been a tremendous session. So well done to all the Assembly members today and the panellists. I think my message, I've been doing this for campaigning for 16 years. My message is that the urgency is as great or greater than ever with these new air quality guidelines. But I think we should really be focused on that word you used in that last series of questions, which is the opportunity. There is an opportunity to re-engineer London to make it an even better place, quieter, healthier place, with apps, for example, around emission-based road charging, which simplify things for people, are attractive to people, that people want to use, which get rid of all these different blunt instruments and all these different problems. So let's make it easy, let's grasp this opportunity, and let's not forget this urgency. But thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you. I think that's a brilliant note to end on. So with that, thank you very much to all our guests. We realise that 3 hours is a long time with such a concentrated discussion, but as you heard, the quality of the discussion I think was absolutely brilliant, and I think that's really going to help us with our work and our investigation. So thank you all very much. I just have a few brief things to do with the rest of the committee, so feel free to leave the call or stay on if you're interested. It's not particularly interesting, I promise you, but thank you very much. So the committee has recommended to note the report as background to putting questions to invited guests and note the subsequent discussion. Is that agreed?
Agreed.
Thank you. The committee has recommended to note its work programme. Is that agreed?
Agreed.
The next meeting of the committee will be replaced by a site visit on Monday, 21st of March 2022. Oh, that might be the 3 children Emma's got there. There is no urgent business. I therefore declare this meeting to be closed, and thanks to my fellow Assembly members too. That was a long one. Thank you.
Thanks, Chair.